Daimon, Guardians of Hades romance series, book number 6, written by Felicity Heaton and narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 20. Darkness surrounded him, black lands as far as the eye could see. A valley rimmed with mountains stretched below him, spotted with clusters of golden lights that shone like dull stars in the night. Escher grinned, felt the thick mixture of demon blood and dirt of the underworld on the left side of his face crack. It was old now, dried and flaking, blood from the wretch he was hunting. Taken the first time Escher had caught up with him shortly after he had dared to enter the underworld. He absently lifted his hand and touched the war paint, pleasure humming in his veins as his fingers traversed the rough spine of it that streaked over his left eye, covering that side of his face from his hair to his jaw. The odor of foul demon blood filled his nostrils, rousing the hunger, keeping it as sharp as a blade. Fresh blood. The darkness bayed for more, and he howled with that need too. He shuddered as he stared down into the valley, cold winds cutting through his torn shirt and jeans, unaware of the world around him, his focus fixed on one thing and one thing alone: the hunt. Pleasure rippled through him again, stronger now. A drugging sensation that had his lips curling further to flash his fangs as his eyelids grew heavy. He breathed deep of the demon blood on his hand, anticipation rolling through him, bringing forth images of the last 2 times he had clashed with the wretch. A wraith. Frustration rolled in on the heels of the satisfaction he took from replaying his battles against the fiend, mounted inside him to pull a growl from his lips. Twice he had clashed with the demon. Twice the male had escaped, but Escher had his scent now. He trudged forwards, boots skidding on the loose shale as he descended the mountain, pulled to the valley, a slave to the black need to hunt, to kill. He shook that thought away, the small part of him that was clinging to consciousness, refusing to fully succumb to the darkness, unleashing a distant scream in his ears. Not kill. He needed the male alive. To torture, to torment, to plunge into a living nightmare, a hell he wouldn't be able to escape. To make him pay. His grin stretched wider. Yes, make him pay. The male would suffer as his sister had, as his brothers had. Escher would see to it personally, drawing out his punishment so it lasted a lifetime and then another. It was what the bastard deserved. His left boot hit a snag and he stumbled forwards a few steps, struggling to find his footing on the steep slope. A snarl tore from him as he found it and halted, as his feet throbbed, pain pulsing in a powerful wave up his legs to steal the strength from them. How long had he been walking? Always moving forwards, never stopping, never resting. He had to keep going. His stomach cramped near constantly now, hunger stealing strength from him, thirst blurring his thoughts. But he couldn't stop. He was close now. He could feel it. He brought his hand back to his lips and flicked his tongue over his blood-stained fingers. Tasted it. He trudged forwards, unaware of the world, uncaring of it. A legion tracked him, but they wouldn't reach him in time. He was close now. He stalked the uneven terrain, his fatigue falling away as he neared the valley bottom, strength flowing back into him as he thought about what was to come. The scent of blood curled around him and his gaze dropped, crimson eyes unerringly locking onto the spot of it that blended with the black rock. His grin stretched wider still. Fresh demon blood. Eli's blood. Escher stalked forwards, his steps sure as adrenaline surged, as pleasing images of capturing the wraith and beginning his torment filled his mind, driving him onwards. No time to rest, no time to delay. His crimson eyes scanned the valley ahead of him, leaping over everything, singling out each cluster of buildings, assessing them all. The valley was filled with places to hide, but not a single place where the wraith could hide from him. The distant screams came again, as thoughts of drenching his hands in demon blood flooded his mind, coaxing a low moan from his lips and sending a shiver down his spine. He tried to quieten the voice, and when that didn't work, he growled at the other side of himself, the pathetic side that wanted to save this wretch. It continued, battering his mind and his will with words about capturing the demon, about questioning it, about the importance of keeping it alive. Escher bared fangs at the thing inside him. He wanted blood. The demon had taken his sister from him, had nearly destroyed his family, and had harmed not only his youngest brother but others that he loved. The demon deserved death. The voice whispered, and he would receive it. Escher stilled, canted his head, and listened to the other side of him, curious now. It wasn't like the weak thing to want to kill. He couldn't recall the last time they had been in accord with each other. The distant voice promised blood, promised retribution, promised the chance to torture, to torment. All things it kept promising. But this time it promised death to the wretch too. Only if he had patience. Patience? Escher spat on the black ground, despising that word for some reason. He had been patient, hadn't he? He frowned, a thread of confusion knitting a jumble of thoughts together in his weary mind. He shook his head, trying to get his thoughts into order, trying to remember. Someone had told him to be patient, someone he loved. An image began to build before him, a figure of a male, but it crumbled before it fully formed. Escher rubbed his temples, closed his eyes, and lowered his head, attempting to coax the memory. It refused to come. So he clawed at his hair, raking black talons over it, drawing his own blood as frustration got the better of him. He didn't want to wait. He growled and turned, looked at his surroundings, and frowned as a thought struck him. What was he doing? Who was he looking for? The owner of that voice was inside him. He clawed at his chest, ripping through the front of his shirt, tearing new gashes in it. If he could get the wretch out of his body, he could kill the demon just as he wanted. No, he couldn't. He stilled, claws buried deep in his own flesh. He needed the wraith alive. Eli was the key. Killing him would only avenge his sister. Capturing him and bringing him to his brothers might save her. But he wanted to kill him. He absently raked his nails over his pectorals as he considered every angle. There was a way he could both avenge his sister and save her. Patience. He had no love for that word, but he would do his best to be patient, even when he didn't want to play any sort of long game. He wanted blood on his hands. He wanted to see that glorious moment when hope turned to despair in the wretch he was hunting. He wanted to watch the light in the wraith's eyes fade. The voice coaxed, whispering sweet words about torturing him, tormenting him, how he could draw out the pain and see that moment of hope giving way to despair over and over again, if he had patience. He huffed and stalked forwards. Fine. If patience was the price to pay for being able to draw out the wretch's suffering, then he would pay it. Although he made no promises that he would be able to control himself when he had the wraith within his reach again. The irritating other side murmured to him things about the Blessed Isles, about getting his sister there. He focused on them as he tracked the wraith. Let them flood his head with pleasing images, ones that leashed the black need to kill, harnessed and honed it into something else. A terrible need to make the bastard suffer at his hands for centuries. He wouldn't kill him, not even when the wraith had given up every drop of information. He would keep the fiend alive, to torture, to torment, to keep locked in a cage for his pleasure. He would do to the male what the wretches had wanted to do to him. His gaze fixed on one black building, a small single-story abode nestled among many others. His grin stretched wider as he sensed the wraith inside. He would make Eli his pet. Chapter 21. Cass pressed her hand to her stomach, clutching it through the black corset as she stared at the onyx ribbons of smoke dissipating before her. Sickness brewed, the knowledge that Daimon had allowed demons to hurt him rousing 1,000 questions in her mind, none of which she liked. Was it her fault? Gods, she felt as if it was. That haunted and pained look he had given her before he had teleported was seared on her mind, together with the state of him. What he had done to himself scared her. The sight of him drenched in black demon blood, crimson seeping from the deep lacerations on his stomach and arms and legs, scared her. The thought that he had teleported when his stumbling steps had made it blindingly clear he was weakened by the battle, could be out there somewhere now, collapsed and vulnerable, terrified her. She needed to see him. She focused, lining up the incantation in her mind, piecing it together as she fixed her thoughts on a destination, transported herself there. She appeared beside the pool set into the white terrace of Daimon's hillside modern home, fatigue washing through her as the spell stole her strength. She gave herself a moment as she peered through the huge panes of tinted glass that were set between white concrete and steel pillars. As soon as her legs felt stable enough, she moved towards the building, her limited senses scouring the area for Daimon. She couldn't feel his power, but he had to be here. She approached the glass door and didn't hesitate when she reached it. She pushed it open, not surprised to find it was unlocked, and eased inside, her pulse picking up as she listened hard. She wasn't sure whether Daimon would appreciate her coming after him, but he could be mad at her all he wanted. He needed someone to take care of him, and she was determined to be that person. Just as she was determined to find out why he had allowed demons to harm him. "Daimon?" she called, softly at first, nerves getting the better of her. When he didn't answer, she put more force behind her voice. "Daimon!" She waited. Still no answer. She moved between the long couch and the immaculate kitchen area, heading deeper into the building, towards white doors she presumed led to bedrooms. The first one she tried was empty. "Daimon?" She backed out of the room and turned towards the other, the sickness growing stronger as she crossed the marble floor. She pushed the door open and looked around the huge bedroom, at the untouched dark blue covers on the king-size bed. "Daimon?" That last attempt to get him to answer felt pointless, but she hadn't been able to stop herself from calling to him again. He wasn't here. She racked her brain, trying to figure out where he might have gone. He was hurt. He wouldn't have gone to the orphanage in that state, and she didn't know of any other homes that he owned. She doubted he had gone to one owned by his brothers since they were all in Tokyo. Cass pulled together the incantation again, her heart drumming at a sickening pace as fear got the better of her. Someone would know where he had gone. Someone would tell her, even if she had to beat it out of them. She closed her eyes and finished the spell, opened them again as she landed back where she had been in the garden of the Tokyo mansion. She reached out with a tracking spell to pinpoint the brothers. Most of them were in Merrick's room, but there was one in the kitchen. Her legs wobbled as she headed in that direction, her steps unsteady. She breathed through the drain on her strength, refusing to give herself time to recover. Daimon was out there, injured and vulnerable. She needed to find him. Someone had to know where he had gone. They just had to. She entered the kitchen and drew up short as she spotted Callistos. He stood at the counter of the galley kitchen, clothed in a fresh t-shirt and jeans, his damp golden hair pulled back into a ponytail. He was already healing, too, something she found curious since she hadn't attended to him and none of the brothers could heal that quickly. She doubted he had allowed Megan to use her healing talent on him, not when he had refused her before. She also doubted that Ares would have allowed it. Callistos was quick to look at her, easing back from preparing vegetables and wiping his hands on a towel. "Something up?" His blonde eyebrows knitted low over stormy eyes, ones that demanded an answer to that question as he stared at her. She pushed down her nerves, pulled up her courage, and refused to let him see that she was shaken, because he would use it as ammunition against her for months. She could see it in his eyes as they slowly narrowed, suspicion and curiosity forming in them. He wanted to find a weakness in her, something he could use against her, a fault he could point out to Mari as retribution for all the times she had brought up his failings in front of her ward. That ward came up behind her, briefly wrapped her in a hug from behind, and then released her and stepped around her. She forced a tight smile as Mari looked at her, one that clearly failed to cover her worry because Mari's beautiful face fell, concern replacing the smile that had been brightening her blue-green eyes. "Something's wrong. What is it?" Mari's blonde eyebrows furrowed as she took a step towards Cass. All of Cass's strength drained from her as she looked into Mari's eyes, as her soft words curled around her and sank deep into her, stripping away the stubborn part of her and pulling forth an urge to let it all rush out of her. "Daimon left. He was injured, perhaps a little angry with me. I only wanted to help him. I don't know where he's gone." She looked at Cal. "I was hoping you might." Callistos pursed his lips, a thoughtful edge to his expression that didn't mask the fact he was going to make her pay for the information he could give her. "What's the deal with you and Daimon?" he said, his blue eyes gaining a victorious glimmer, because he thought he had her on the ropes, that she would surrender something he could use against her in some way. "There is no deal." She tipped her chin up. Cal folded his arms across his chest, his black t-shirt tightening over his honed muscles. I'm not telling you where he might have gone until you fess up to things. You're crushing on Daimon. Cass glared at him. I am not. She was, but she feared this was more than a crush. She had feelings for Daimon, and they ran deep. It is pretty obvious. Mari cut off when Cass turned her glare on her. It's complicated. Cass didn't want to say any more than that, not even when Callistos and Mirinda both looked as if they were expecting her to do just that. She cursed herself when she couldn't stop her nerves, her fears from getting the better of her, and ended up adding, I'm not sure Daimon really likes me. Gods, she felt like an idiot schoolgirl with a crush as those words leaked from her, desperately hoping one of his friends would reveal his true feelings to her to allay her fears. Cal shrugged. He must, since he can't touch you. It can't be lust. He can touch me, she admitted, unable to hold that back too, and realized it was the crux of her fears. Did Daimon only like her because he could touch her? Before she had revealed that she could use magic to negate his ice, he had been attracted to her, hadn't he? But he had changed after she had revealed that to him. She couldn't deny that, and she had no way of knowing whether the knowledge that he could touch her had only unleashed him, freeing him and allowing him to act on the attraction he felt towards her. Shit, Cal muttered and looked at Mari and then back at her. I mean, I'd say it explains a lot because you're hardly girlfriend material, but... What is that supposed to mean? Cass snapped, her hackles rising as she glared at Cal, daring him to admit he had been insinuating that his brother only wanted her because he could touch her, and that Daimon would never consider her as a possible girlfriend. Not that she wanted to be his girlfriend or anything like it for that matter. Cal hiked his shoulders. I'm just saying it as I see it. You, Cassandra, don't strike me as the girlfriend, long-term commitment type. You are hardly in a position to judge me. Or must I remind you of the numerous times I have seen you seducing your way through a bar, targeting a whole slew of women? She gave him a black look, one that she knew conveyed every ounce of her anger because he stiffened, turned awkward. Yeah, well, shoulda changes. I'm just saying is all, he grumbled and rubbed the back of his neck, his blue eyes filled with worry. But this thing with Daimon, don't make him think it's more than it is, yeah? I don't want to see my brother get hurt. Cass threw her hands up, frustration getting the better of her. That's the second threat I've received tonight. Cal's right eyebrow jacked up. Second? Who else threatened you? She clamped her lips shut. He looked as if he was going to push the subject and then sighed. Fine. Truth is, Daimon is probably in Hong Kong. He's not there. She didn't hide the worry that tinged her voice. I already checked. There has to be somewhere else he might go. Aiko appeared at the other end of the kitchen, rubbing her black hair with a pink towel. Well, who might go? Her brown eyes were ringed with dark circles, fatigue lacing them. Or perhaps depression. Cass had no experience of that herself, but she could see that Escher's continuing absence was weighing heavily on the young Japanese woman. Daimon. Cass's shoulders slumped as hope bled from her. He was in a mood. He left, and I don't know where he went, and I'm worried about him. Cal gave her a look, not one of his usual smirking glances that said he was going to enjoy pouncing on whatever she had just said or done to use it as payback. He looked worried and perhaps a little relieved, because she had just admitted without so many words that she cared about his brother. She checked Hong Kong. Cal twisted and eased his backside against the counter so he could see Aiko. Aiko's nose wrinkled slightly as she frowned, her eyes dropping to the floor as the towel paused against her hair. When she lifted her gaze and fixed it on Cass, hope dared to bloom again. I know where he might have gone. Each word that left Aiko's lips was carefully weighed, her gaze turning scrutinizing as she looked across the room at Cass. I heard them talking about it once. Daimon and Escher. Tears laced Aiko's dark eyes, the pain that beat in them sounding in his name. Where might he have gone? Cass felt like a bitch for pushing, but she had the dreadful feeling that time was of the essence. Aiko's lips parted and then closed, and she stared at Cass, studying her in silence for a long minute before she finally spoke. He likes to go there when he wants to be alone. Cass didn't miss the emphasis Aiko placed on the last 4 words, the warning to give Daimon space. She couldn't heed it, no matter how much she wanted to do that. Something was wrong with him, and he needed help with his injuries. She couldn't let him be out there alone, vulnerable, in a bad place. She feared he would do something reckless. More reckless than allowing demons to hurt him. "Please, Aiko," Cass whispered, her voice heavy with the fear that flowed through her. Cal and Mari exchanged a worried look. Aiko slowly nodded. "Try heading to Antarctica, to Halley Bay. They talked about it once." Aiko's words offered both a solution and a problem. Cass looked down at herself, at her strapless corset and leather trousers. Hardly the clothing for Antarctica, even in summer. But she had been raised in the frigid remote reaches of Siberia. She had endured freezing winters. She was tough. She could handle a little cold. "Thank you." She bowed her head to Aiko and hurried to her room, dug out the mundane black woolen sweater she had brought with her and pulled it on. She pulled open the drawers on the dresser, seeking more layers, anything that would keep the chill off her long enough that she could find Daimon. Nothing in them was of any use to her, so she went to the wall to her right and slid the panel open, revealing a cupboard. It contained a lot of shirts and some trousers. She hurried through them, pushing them down the bar, and breathed a sigh of relief when she reached the end and spotted something tucked in the far corner of the cupboard. A coat. She pulled it off the hanger and brushed it down, sent up a prayer that nothing was living in it because the black woolen jacket looked as if it had been sitting there collecting dust for at least a decade. Cass slipped her arms into it, pulled it closed, and formed the incantation, hoping it would work. It was always hit and miss when she didn't know the location she wanted to transport herself to. Sometimes the magical pathways that connected every place in the world had a different name for the location, and she ended up somewhere she didn't want to be. Sometimes there were far too many places named the same thing, and she ended up going nowhere. She focused on Antarctica, on Halley Bay, not knowing what to expect if the spell did work and transported her there. Magic hummed inside her, pulsed in her bones and flowed in her veins, wrapping her in a layer of warmth that quickly dissipated as she touched down. Frigid cold blasted her, the icy wind slicing straight through the layers she had donned, numbing her flesh and freezing her blood. She huddled down into the coat as she squinted against the bright, vast white that encompassed her, shuddering as the wind felt as if it was cutting her to the bone, flaying the flesh from them. Snow battered her, saturating her hair in an instant, turning it to tangled black ribbons that sapped even more warmth from her skin. She turned and winced as the wind drove the icy flakes into her eyes, twisted away again and looked around her. Her legs shook beneath her feet so cold that she couldn't feel them. Cass scoured the area, expending valuable energy using a spell to seek out Daimon, a small voice at the back of her mind telling her this was reckless, dangerous, and that she had to go back. She couldn't see more than a few feet through the blizzard, and she was already dangerously low on energy. If she lingered, the cold might steal enough of her strength that she would be stranded. But she had to find Daimon. A stronger blast of wind hit her in the back, sending her stumbling forwards. She trudged in the direction the wind was pushing her, eyes darting as she tried to make things out. Fear rolled up on her, making her doubt each step she took as her heart pounded. Thoughts that she might walk right into a crevasse or off a cliff ricocheting around her mind. This was foolish. She had to leave. She couldn't withstand such harsh elements for much longer. If she tried, she would lose her ability to teleport. She would die out here, alone. She pulled the jacket closed even tighter, burrowed down into it as a thought struck her, rising from her heart. She didn't want to die without seeing Daimon's face one last time. She wanted to see his heart through his eyes again, see him open to her, needed it and refused to give in until she had it. She ached for the feel of his arms around her, his skin heating her. Cass pulled her right hand away from her coat and coaxed fire into her palm. It warmed her a little, but the flame was small, kept stuttering out in the wind. She shuffled forwards. Was it growing darker? She looked around her, flinching as ice battered the side of her face. It was definitely growing darker. Her steps slowed, her feet grew heavy. The flame hovering above her palm died. Cass's knees gave out and she sank into the snow, teeth chattering as her heart clenched. Mother Earth, sweet gods. She curled over, hugging herself, desperate to get some heat back into her body. She just wanted to see Daimon again, would give her last breath to see that he was alive and safe. The darkness closed in and she tried to fight it, panic lancing her as she realized it wasn't night falling but her body failing. The cold that gripped her worsened, sapping the last of her strength. But then warmth touched her face. Something lifted her, cradled her gently against a hard chest. A heartbeat steady and strong against her ear, loud in spite of the roaring icy wind that no longer touched her. The sound died, spun away with the cold and the pain, leaving her dizzy and sleepy. "Don't sleep, baby. Stay with me." Those words roused her, gave her the strength to open her eyes and catch the glimpse of Daimon she had prayed to Mother Earth to receive. He leaned over her, his white hair slicked back, his cheeks pink. Not concern in his beautiful, intense eyes, but fear. Cold, stark fear that did nothing to warm her. He bobbed up and down in time with her, kept glancing towards her lap, to her hands. Why? She tried to lift her head to see, but it felt too heavy and she collapsed back against him. Sleep beckoned again. "Stay awake." He jostled her, jerking her left and then right, moving her arms. The chilling cold of her coat and sweater disappeared, and she tried to look at herself to see what he was doing. Her eyes slid down to her hands as they felt different, warmer. He was rubbing them. Her eyes widened, horror flashing through her. Her fingers were mottled, black and red, blue in places. Fear seized her, sank claws deep into her to steal her breath. Daimon leaned over her and blew on her hands, hot and moist, chasing some of the numbing cold from them, and then he was lifting her again. The sound of bubbling water filled the deafening silence, and she looked down as he eased her into it, her fuzzy mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The water felt cold, but there was steam rising from it. The fog in her mind gradually cleared as heat began to seep into her. She looked at Daimon where he leaned against the edge of the hot tub to her left, his face stricken, fear lighting his eyes. Fear that turned to relief and then something darker as he sank forwards. "Why did you do something as stupid as following me?" he bit out, his voice dripping with the anger that flared in his eyes. Sleep washed over her again, threatening to pull her under as the warmth of the water suffused her. Her eyes slipped shut. Gods, she wanted to sleep for days. Maybe forever. "Stay awake. I won't lose you." Daimon shook her. She slowly opened her eyes and frowned at him. "I'm here. No need to shout." "Sorry," he murmured, his white eyebrows furrowing as the anger that had been in his eyes abated, shifting to concern again. He lifted his left hand and touched her burning cheeks, and she wanted to close her eyes again to savor the blissful coolness of his skin. Cass struggled to keep her eyes open, stared at his face as he worked to warm her, rubbing her hands and her shoulders, scooping the water over her skin. She had never seen him look so afraid. It was strange to see such a strong warrior looking so weak, ruled by fear. Fear she had caused. "I was looking for you," she murmured, her voice hoarse, as if she had been screaming. She wanted to lift her hand and rub her throat, but she didn't have the strength. His pale blue eyes shifted to meet hers. She looked deep into them, drinking her fill of the concern that shimmered in them, the feelings he tried so hard to hide from her, ones that filled her too. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." His white eyebrows met hard. "I'm not. Not now. I don't think I ever will be. I feel sick." He lowered his eyes to the bubbling water and her heart clenched, the fear she had managed to banish rising again to consume her as it whispered in her ear, taunting her with the fact she had driven him to this, that she was responsible for him wanting pain. His eyes lifted again, colliding with hers. "I need to hear you'll be all right." It hit her that he hadn't been talking about his state of mind, but about the state of her. That touched her, deeper than he would ever know. It warmed her, too, gave her back some strength, enough that she managed to lift her hand from the water and place it over his where it gripped the edge of the tub. "I'll be fine, Daimon. Will you?" Her eyes searched his. Surprise claimed her as he briefly tangled his fingers with hers, and then cold blasted through her as he released her hand and pulled away. He busied himself with punching some buttons on a panel, doing it with a vengeance. With such force, she expected him to poke a hole straight through it. The water warmed, deliciously hot. He settled back beside her again and slipped his left hand into the water, took hold of hers and inspected it. Cass sucked down a breath and then looked down at her hands, afraid of what she would see. Relief washed through her. They looked better, flushed pink and not blue or black. Daimon gently submerged her hands and chunks of ice formed on the surface. Sorry. He went to take his hand away and she tried to stop him but wasn't fast enough. She rubbed her hands together, sneaking a glance at him as he frowned at the panel again. The blood that had been covering him was gone, but the lacerations in his roll neck remained, and the long gashes that were visible on his chest, shoulders, and arms were angry red and still seeping blood in places. "Will you be all right?" she whispered. "The cuts—" "Already healing," he interjected, sending another wave of relief through her, this one so strong that she spoke before considering the consequences. "Why did you let them cut you?" Guilt danced across his noble features, and he turned his cheek to her, and her stomach fell as he all but confirmed she had been right. He had let the demons hurt him. She gathered her courage and lifted her hand. Water sluiced down her bare arm and dripped from her elbow, the sound mingling with the gentle bubbling to fill the thick silence. Daimon tensed when she touched his cheek, and then he closed his eyes, frowned, and exhaled through his nose as he leaned into her palm. "Tell me, please," she murmured. This time he turned his face the other way, away from her, placing himself beyond her reach. He stood and backed off a step, and fear seized her again. "Stay," she commanded. Her heart lurched into her throat. "Don't leave me. I need you here. I need to know." "You don't. And I don't want to talk about it. Let it go." He turned and stalked into the house. Like hell she would. Cass gritted her teeth, gripped the edge of the tub, and pushed herself up. The water weighed her down, making her legs tremble beneath her, but it quickly drained noisily into the tub. Her entire body shook as she lifted her left leg, clutching the tub as she labored for breath. Her muscles cramped and protested, bones burned, but she pushed onwards. She managed to get her leg over the side of the tub. Her foot pressed against the broad white tiles of the terrace. Her leg gave out the moment she put all her weight onto it, and she shrieked as the flagstones came at her. Strong arms banded around her waist and stopped her from hitting it face first. Daimon pulled her onto her feet and set her down, muttering, "Foolish woman." She felt as though she was. She was pursuing a man who wanted nothing to do with her, a man who electrified her and made her feel alive for the first time in her long life, a man she didn't want to leave. She hadn't been prepared for this. For him. Cass looked up at him, her brow furrowed as her eyes locked with his. His beauty, the melancholy he wore, the heat that shimmered just beneath his frosty surface, all of it had entranced her, bewitched her. Now she didn't want to leave him even when he made her feel as if there was no point in her staying. More of her strength returned, enough that she could probably cast smaller spells if she dared, maybe even transport herself if she pushed herself hard enough. A gasp tore from her lips as he slid the zipper on the side of her corset down, and her heart jerked, her hand flying to the front of the garment to keep it against her breasts. "Just trying to get you warm. Getting you out of these wet things is a good place to start." He averted his eyes. "If I didn't think you'd fall on your arse, I'd let you do it yourself." Cass hesitated, told herself not to read into things, and failed dismally. "I know how you can warm me." She looked up into his eyes when he glanced at her. "Kiss me." He glowered at her. "No." "Why not?" She sidled closer, pressing her body to his, and some of the ice in his eyes melted, giving way to heat. "I can't," he croaked. "Sure you can. Just purse your lips." She tilted her head up and leaned towards him. "Press them to mine." "No." It was firmer this time, and he gripped her shoulders and pushed her back. She frowned at him. "Why not?" "Because," he whispered, the sound tortured, distant, carrying so much pain that her temper shifted course, the spike of frustration and anger she had felt giving way to softer feelings. His eyes leaped between hers. You can never be mine." Cass blinked. That was why he had changed, going from warming towards her to cold and seeking pain, because he thought she could never be his. His hands trembled against her bare shoulders, and his breath shook as he stared at her, waiting for an answer. "What made you think that?" It wasn't an answer, but she had to put it out there. He turned his cheek to her. "Your promise to another." His eyes brightened, dangerous white ringed with black, and he growled. His hands tightened against her shoulders, pain pricking her there in several places. She angled her head and looked at his left hand, at the icy claws that pierced her. "Daimon?" She flinched when he snarled and pushed away from her, stalking into the house again. Cass slowly walked after him, not trusting her legs. They were stronger now, but pushing herself would only end with her hitting the ground, and she needed to reach Daimon before he did something annoying like teleporting away from her. She breathed a sigh of relief when she made it to the door of the house and found him still inside. "Who am I promised to?" She winced as she remembered he had seen the letter. For a wonderful moment, she had forgotten about that. He growled over his shoulder at her. "I don't want to talk about it." Well, she did. He had snooped at her things, and now he was presuming things about her, things that weren't true, things that were on the verge of ruining everything. She crossed the room, caught his wrist, and pulled him to face her, almost falling on her backside in the process. "I'm not promised to anyone." He wrenched free of her. "You are. Someone, I don't know. The letter said it. You must return to bear a child." A child she didn't want, with a man she didn't want. Words bubbled up her throat, things she had only just realized but still hadn't thought she would confess to anyone. "Daimon." She reached for him. He smacked her hand away. "Don't." He stormed towards the room with the king-size bed in it. Cass transported herself there and regretted it when she landed in front of him, blocking his path as intended, and collapsed. Daimon was there again, catching her, cradling her to him as he looked her over and softly muttered, "We need to get you out of these wet things." Changeable, beautiful man. She couldn't keep up with him when he was like this, flitting between polar emotions. She wanted him to stay like this, soft with her, taking care of her, letting her be close to him. She didn't want him to remind her of the letter, or the fact her coven were waiting, expecting her to return, to do the unthinkable. She wanted to stay here, lost in Daimon, caught up in a life that felt like an impossible but beautiful dream. "Warm me with a kiss," she whispered. He stilled, his eyes hardening again. "No, I couldn't bear it. If he wouldn't kiss her." She looped her arms around his neck and kissed him. He responded in an instant, his cool tongue pushing past the barrier of her lips to brush the length of hers. She melted in his arms as they tightened around her, pinning her to him, leaned back and lured him down with her. Her back hit the mattress and she moaned as his weight settled on top of her, and he deepened the kiss, branding his name on her soul. Daimon eased back and looked down at her, something shining in his pale blue eyes. What was he thinking? He swept his right hand through her wet hair, smoothing the tangles, his look softening. "You're beautiful," he husked, sorrow lacing his voice. "I wish you were mine." So did she. She thought it, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. She raised both hands and cupped his cheeks, stared deep into his eyes and lost herself in them, drowning in the emotions they contained. There was pain there, locked deep inside. What did he want to say but couldn't? Was it the same words she wanted to voice but refused to come? "This is pointless," he muttered instead and pressed his hands to the mattress, pushing himself up. Cass tried to pull him back down to her so she could kiss him again. He went rigid, his arms locking tight, and she glared at him when she realized she couldn't move him. "Daimon," she stroked his cheeks. "I don't want to think about all the tomorrows that await me. Please, just have this moment with me." Pain flickered in his eyes. "I can't." "Why not?" Her throat closed up, but she refused to give in to the despair that trickled through her, refused to give up. "I need more than this moment." He lowered his head and pressed his forehead to hers, his breath washing across her lips. Familiar fear ran through her, tried to steal her voice. But this time she didn't let it. because her heart screamed that she wasn't the only one who was afraid. Daimon was too. Cass palmed his cheeks, drew down a steadying breath, and closed her eyes as she whispered, "So do I, Daimon. So do I. I need you." Chapter 22. Daimon knew he should find the strength to walk away, that it was the best thing to do. But it wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't what he needed. He needed this beautiful, irritating sorceress who lay beneath him, her pale blue eyes glittering with desire that drummed in his veins, too. Fear still had him in its hold, born of a combination of sensing Cass had followed him to Antarctica and discovering her collapsed in a heap, on the verge of death, and the thought of finally giving in to her, to himself. He wanted Cass, and he was tired of fighting it, was tired of letting thoughts of tomorrow hold him back when he should have been fighting for her instead. He would make her see that he was the one she really needed. He would give her the piece of himself he had been holding back. He would make her fall in love with him just as he was falling deeply in love with her. He pulled down a steadying breath, lowered his head, and captured her lips. They were warm against his, incredibly soft, and tasted sweet. He couldn't recall the last time he had kissed someone, wasn't prepared for the way it hit him, rousing fierce hungers inside him and a deep, dark possessiveness. Cass was his. He angled his head and breached her lips, kissed her deeper, and shivered as she moaned and arched up off the mattress to press against him. A groan slipped from his lips as she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down into contact with her. The damp from her clothes soaked into his, had him pulling back even when he didn't want to and breaking the kiss. "Need to get you out of these wet things," he muttered, his breathing rough as he thought about stripping her. Couldn't remember the last time he had undressed a woman either. Nerves rose, trying to get the better of him, but he pushed them back down. This wasn't his first time, even if it felt like it. He reached for the zipper on her corset and paused, glanced into her eyes. "The spell you used to stop me from hurting you. How long will it last?" Cass's nose wrinkled and she shrugged. "Maybe 30 minutes more. It's hard to tell." She stroked her palms over his shoulders and down his chest, a wicked edge to her smile. "But if you last longer than that, I can renew it after I give you a gold medal." He groaned, his face crumpling at the thought of what was to come as heat washed through him, fire lighting up his veins and stirring his cock. It stiffened painfully in his damp jeans. "If you feel even the slightest chill." He stared deep into her eyes, making sure she understood, that she would do what he was asking. "I'll let you know before it happens." She skimmed her fingers over his nipples, sending another shiver through him, and then warmth. He looked down, frowned as the cuts he could see through the slashes in his top began to heal before his eyes, and lifted his gaze to lock with hers again. She hiked her shoulders. "Can't have you not at your physical peak." He groaned again, wished she would stop reminding him where this was going, because he really wanted to last long enough to at least make it to the silver medal. The way she kept teasing him, making his mind leap forwards to imagine being inside her, was going to have him coming in at bronze if she kept it up. Daimon focused on small things, starting with unzipping her black corset the rest of the way. When the two sides of the zipper parted, his heart hitched and his breath trembled, all of his focus shifting to his hands as he eased the front open. "Sweet gods," he muttered, voice scraping low as he stared down at her breasts, transfixed by her dusky nipples as they stiffened, begging for his lips. Cass looked down at her breasts and then up at his face. "What are you waiting for?" He wasn't sure. He swooped on them, telling himself that he had kissed her without hurting her, had touched her without hurting her. He could do this and so much more without hurting her, too. His lips closed around her left nipple, and he groaned as she moaned and arched her back up, pressing her breast to his face. Her fingers tangled in his hair, twisting it hard as she clutched him to her. "Daimon," she whispered, his name a breathless, delicious plea that had his cock kicking against his jeans. He sucked and licked her nipple, lavishing it with the attention it deserved, and lowered his hand to his jeans, palmed his length, and shifted it into a less painful position. Cass only made it harder when she dropped one hand to her other breast and played with her nipple, rolling and tweaking the bud. Good gods, He felt sure he had never been with a woman who actively pleasured herself right in front of him. The sight of her teasing her own flesh, stoking her own arousal, had him as hard as steel. He wanted to see what she would do if she had access to other parts of herself. His hand drifted to her leathers, fumbled with the button and then the zip. They were too damp to push down with one hand, so he reluctantly released her and eased back onto his knees. He gripped both sides of her trousers and shimmied them down, Cass tormenting him the entire time he wrestled with them. She circled her nipples with her fingers, her gaze hooded and fixed on him. "Really making this hard," he gritted as 1,000 hot shivers raced through him, cranking his need up, pushing him to the edge before he had even gotten her naked. She smiled saucily, lifted her left foot and ran it down his crotch. "Already seems pretty hard to me." Daimon caught her foot to stop her, glanced at it and stilled. When he had removed her boots, her toes had been black, but now they were a delicate pink again. He dropped his head and kissed each toe. "Didn't know you had a fetish." Cass's sultry voice teased his senses, keeping his need at a boil. He lowered her foot and finished removing her leathers, and paused as he tossed them over his shoulder, drinking in the sight of her stretched out on his bed wearing nothing but a flimsy pair of black lace shorts. Daimon reached for them. Cass planted her feet against his chest. I think it's your turn to lose some clothing." He was quick to stand and obey that order, tugged his top off and dropped it by his feet, swiftly following it with his jeans. He kicked them off and stood before her, battling another wave of nerves. Her eyes drifted over him, her pupils dilating as her gaze traversed his chest and then his stomach, and finally settled on his trunks. "And the rest." She waggled her right foot at his underwear, her eyes remaining locked on it. He swallowed, ran his fingers along the waistband, and then shoved them down and stepped out of them. Cass moaned as he straightened, her teeth teasing her lower lip as she frowned at him. "Exquisite." He definitely hadn't been called that before. She crooked a finger at him before slipping it between her lips to suck it. He groaned as she popped it free of her lips and trailed it between her breasts, over the flat plane of her stomach to her navel and then lower. She traced the waist of her panties, her eyes dark and beckoning him. Gods, there were 1,000 things he wanted to do with her, but he knew where he wanted to start. He caught her ankles and spread her legs, leaned over her and pressed his mouth to her flesh through the lace of her panties. She gasped and bucked up, her hand flying to his head, fingers twining in his hair as her breaths came faster. Daimon groaned and laved her, tasting her sweetness, aching with need that rode him hard, had him wanting to rush. He tore another gasp from her as he ripped her flimsy underwear away, as his mouth met bare flesh and he stroked his tongue hard over her pert bead. "Gods," she muttered and clutched him, hips rocking in a sensual way. And he discovered he loved that about her, loved the fact she participated in everything, didn't just lay there and let him do the work. She rode his tongue, moaning things in Russian that cranked the heat in his veins up another 10 degrees. Daimon stroked his fingers over her soft, slick flesh as he suckled her bead, groaned against her as he felt how wet she was, how ready for him. His cock kicked against the blue covers and he lowered his hips and rubbed against them, needing some relief. Cass cried out when he eased 2 fingers into her heat gripping them tightly as she clenched, ripping another low moan from him. He pumped her as he rubbed his length against the mattress, his breaths coming faster in time with hers. She suddenly stilled and wriggled, shifting up the bed and pulling away from him. Had he done something wrong? He lifted his head to look at her, sure that he had. She did look angry, but then her face softened. "You keep doing that, and I won't get you inside me. And I need you inside me, Daimon." She jerked her chin towards him, and heat scalded his cheeks when he realized she was talking about him rubbing the covers. "Been a while," he muttered. "Got a bit carried away." She smiled softly. "Been a while for me, too." But probably nowhere near as long as it had been for him. She patted the covers beside her. He crawled up the bed to her, but rather than going where she wanted, he prowled towards her instead. Her smile gained a wicked edge again as he forced her backwards, as she hit the bedclothes beneath him and he covered her again. She skimmed her hand down his arm as he kissed her, savoring the way her tongue tangled with his, How their breath mingled. A groan leaked from him when she took hold of his hand and placed it between her thighs, stroked herself with him before her fingers trailed away. He kept stroking her, lost in how slick she was. So lost he didn't notice her hand moving until it suddenly wrapped around his cock. He barked out a moan and gritted his teeth, shuddered as bliss rolled through him. Her hand was hot on his flesh, gliding up and down it, sending lightning striking along his nerves with every stroke. "Gods," he uttered and pressed his forehead to hers, unable to focus on kissing her as she stroked him, as her fingers closed around his shaft to squeeze it. He was about to tell her to stop when she flipped him and rose over him, her hands pinning his shoulders to the mattress and her lips descending on his. She moaned in time with him as she brought her hips down, as her slick heat pressed against his hard shaft. Daimon swallowed hard, fought the urge to roll her over and bury himself in her, because he had the feeling his little sorceress wanted to be in charge, and gods, he was fine with that. She stroked her right hand down his chest. His heart drummed hard against it, and he tensed as she reached his stomach. "Relax," she murmured against his lips. Easy for her to say. He breathed through the panic, through the spike in arousal, and focused on kissing her. It worked until she gripped his cock. He reached for it too, needing to rush this part before he lost his nerve. He closed his hand around hers and positioned the blunt tip, groaned with her as it brushed through her soft flesh and nudged inside. The moment he began to inch inside her, he released his length and seized her hips, pushed her down onto it. A sweet cry left her lips, the sound drugging, his new addiction, together with the way she rotated her hips on him, swirling them in a maddening way. He tipped his head back into the mattress, clutched her hips, and pumped into her, lost in 1,000 colliding sensations. She planted her hands to his chest, scalding him with her touch, and kissed him again as she began to move on him, bouncing in time with his thrusts. Her breath stuttered against his lips, breasts brushing his chest each time he plunged into her, her soft cries guiding him. Daimon pressed his heels into the bed and bent his knees, pumping her harder, losing himself as need built inside him, pushing him to the edge. He reached for release with every thrust, each downward plunge Cass made to take him back into her, every gasping moan that she breathed against his lips between kisses. She murmured things in Russian again, demanding things that had him smiling as he gripped her hips, as he gave her exactly what she wanted, stroking her with the entire length of his cock on each long, fast thrust. She tensed, her moans growing more desperate, and his balls drew up as she gripped him, as she tightened around him and had stars winking across his vision. Good gods! Cass broke away from his lips, feverishly kissed and nipped at his shoulder, and then pushed back. She threw her head back as she planted her hands against his chest, her black hair spilling like a waterfall down her back as she rode him harder. Her face twisted, bliss painted across it, and he groaned as he watched her, as he watched his length entering her over and over again. The dark, possessive side of him snarled that she was his now. He wouldn't let anyone take her from him. He grasped her hips and thrust harder into her, possessing her, losing himself to that darker side of his blood. She moaned louder, her face screwing up, lips parting as she tilted her head back. "Oh, gods," she whispered, and then screamed. Her entire body tensed and then pulsed around him, her thighs quivering against his hips as she struggled for breath. Daimon roared as he followed her, as seed boiled up his shaft and he sank it deep into her, spilling himself so hard his vision tunneled. He held her on him as his length pulsed and throbbed, clutched her there long after he was done and couldn't convince himself to release her. He stared at her, keeping her on him, feeling himself inside her, connected to her. Mine. The darker side of his blood snarled that word, and he felt it in every inch of him. She was his, and he was never letting her go. Eventually, Cass sagged against his chest, her warm breath skating across his skin, and he wrapped his arms around her, heart thundering, body tingling as he struggled to come down. He felt her smile against his chest, smiled too when she patted it and whispered, "Gold medal." Chapter 23. Cass lazed at Daimon's side, sheltered in his arms, her legs tangled with his and her fingers maddening him as they traced circles on his chest, teasing his bare skin with her warmth. A little smile curled her lips as her hand drifted lower, the satisfied edge to her pale blue eyes hitting him hard, but not as hard as the fact he was holding her like this, sharing a quiet moment that felt intimate, life-altering for them both. He lifted his hand and brushed 2 fingers through her wavy raven hair, clearing a lock from her face so he could see it better. God, she was beautiful. More so now her makeup had been washed away, revealing her natural beauty. Stunning ice-blue eyes that glittered with faint silver stars, long black lashes framing them, a subtly sloping nose he wanted to drop a kiss on, full rosy lips that begged him to kiss her there instead. He had never seen a woman as beautiful, as bewitching as her. He smiled slightly. Maybe that was his feelings doing the talking, placing her on that high pedestal for him to worship. He was sure all his brothers would say the same about their women. She leaned back and he didn't stop her, not when her fingers kept gliding downwards and arousal tightened his body, had his muscles tensing in a way that was sure to keep her eyes on his body and her mind on another round of lovemaking. Her tempting lips pursed as her eyes dropped, following her hand. Her fingers encircled his navel. Her gaze flicked up to meet his. "Is this your favor, Mark?" She traced one of the wavy beams of ink that arced towards his left hip. The last time she had asked him that, he hadn't answered her. He nodded and glanced down, bit back a groan as he watched her slip her hand lower, to follow the beam that reached down towards his groin. "Who is it from?" She teased the pointed tip of the beam, far too close to his stirring cock for him to focus on delivering an answer to that question. She seemed to sense it because she dragged her hand back up and circled his navel, a lazy swirl that kept his blood at a low boil. "Who?" He swallowed, shunned the hungers that rode him, and looked back into her eyes. "Apollo." "Apollo," she repeated, her voice low and thoughtful. "Odd that a god of the sun would favor a god of something aligned with winter." It wasn't the first time someone had said such a thing to him, and he shut it out, refusing to allow Penelope into this moment. He had loved her, but now that he was looking back, that love had been slow to come, had only manifested after he had discovered she had fallen pregnant. And gods, that made him feel like a dick. He had wanted to stand by her, and he would have spent the rest of his life devoted to her and their family if she hadn't been taken from him. But the love he had felt for her was nothing like the feelings he had for Cass. Those feelings made him see that what he had thought was love had been something born of obligation and a need to take responsibility rather than born of his heart. If she hadn't fallen pregnant, he would have drifted apart from her soon enough, moving on to another woman. He hated thinking about her in that way, but it was the truth. He had loved her, but he hadn't been in love with her. He stared at Cass, balancing on a precipice that felt dangerous, a fall in all directions. Before a question could arise from his heart, he focused on what they had been talking about, using it to keep thoughts about his feelings at bay. "According to my parents, Apollo saw the creativity in me, the ability to love art and music, and to create art too, and that was the reason he chose to give me his favor." He looked down at his navel, at the sun that was a shade darker than his skin right now, all calm, wavy beams. When his mood faltered, it darkened to black and the beams grew pointed and jagged. "You are good at sculpture." She pushed herself up on her left elbow and looked towards the door of the bedroom. "I noticed the marble statues in the garden." "All his work." "You got me." He didn't miss the look that flitted across her face, one that said she did have him, and in more than the way he had meant it. He also didn't miss the troubled edge that her eyes gained following it. She had promised no talking about tomorrow, and he was trying not to think about it. It wasn't going to happen. Not if he had any say in it. Cass was his, and he was going to fight to keep her. He was going to do all in his power to convince her that this was where she wanted to be, in his arms. He tightened those arms around her and kissed her, savoring the softness of her lips against his, how she opened for him and teased his tongue with hers as she leaned into his kiss, seeking more. Daimon groaned as she pressed her body against his, her warmth seeping into him, her softness enticing him. He lowered his hands, one claiming the small of her back as the other cupped her bare backside beneath the covers. He eased her closer, relished her sweet moan as her hips rocked forward to meet his. He broke away from her lips and kissed along her jaw, trailed his mouth down her throat and peppered it with kisses as he held her, kept her pinned against him, filled with a need to clutch her tighter and never let her go. "This is nice," she whispered and arched her head back, giving him better access to her throat. "I could get used to this, waking in your arms, being worshipped by you, worshipping you." He groaned again and nuzzled her neck. "I could get used to this too, and it's more than nice." She sighed and skimmed her hands up his shoulders and neck and claimed his cheeks. She pulled him away from her throat and kissed him again, soft ones that roused feelings in him, sensations of warmth and lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. They were too much. He pulled back and pressed his forehead to hers, needing a moment to get his unruly emotions back under control, before he did something that made him look like a fool, like tearing up. Cass stroked his cheeks, her eyes fixed on his, the soft look in them saying it was too late, and she already knew he was fighting emotions that were too powerful for him to handle. He stared at her. This had to last more than today, more than tomorrow. It had to last forever. He didn't want to give her up, never wanted to be apart from her. He had to convince her that duty wasn't everything. Sometimes it didn't make you happy. Sometimes it was a torment, one that it was better to turn your back on. He was testament to that. He had hated every moment he had been in this world, trapped here within his ice, separated from everyone he loved by fear of hurting them. He stared deeper into her eyes, trying to see her true feelings about what her coven wanted her to do, hoping to catch a glimpse of them. She had ignored their summons on repeated occasions if the letter was to be believed. That had to mean she had her reservations about going through with this tradition, fulfilling her duty to the coven. It had to. He needed to get her to admit the real reason she had been avoiding returning to the coven. Something vibrated. His phone. He frowned as he drew back from Cass, torn between saying what was on his mind, trying to get that confession from her, and answering it. It could only be one of his brothers, and the last thing he needed was whoever was on the other end of the line, stepping to his house and finding him tangled in the sheets with Cass. Maybe he could wait for the call to end and then fire off a message to them. He rolled and leaned over the edge of the bed, fished his jeans from the floor, and pulled his phone from the pocket. He grimaced as a glowering picture of Ares filled the screen, and he saw the notification at the top telling him he had 9 missed calls and a lot of text messages. Daimon twisted onto his back and sighed as his head hit the pillows. "Ares," he said as Cass gave him a curious look. "Answer it." She nudged his shoulder and he reached for her, but she evaded him, scooting to the edge of the bed to stand and tease him with her nakedness. "I'll shower while you speak to him." Daimon groaned. That's not helping. He wanted to be in the shower with her, washing her, worshipping her. She cast a pointed look at his hips beneath the covers. "It isn't?" He ignored the hard-on he was sporting and thoughts of forgetting his brother's call and showering with Cass instead, and answered his phone. "What's up?" He gunned for casual and instantly regretted it when Aries' voice boomed down the line. "What's up? What's up? I'll tell you what's up, little brother," Aries barked, and Daimon flinched. "You go AWOL, Cass goes AWOL too, and then Cal tells me she went off to Antarctica, so I'm guessing she went after you, and then we don't hear from either of you for hours. Hours!" Daimon knew better than to take the pause as an invitation to speak. Aries was probably just wrestling his temper back under control, trying not to set his phone on fire. Megan's voice broke the tense silence, too distant for him to make out what she said. A noisy scratching sound hit him, and then Aries responded, muffled by his hand. "I'm dealing with it." A pause. "No, I won't play nice," Aries grumbled. "Daimon knows better than to disappear like that." His brother huffed, whatever Megan said to him cooling some of his fire, because when he next spoke, he sounded around 300% calmer. "Fine." The scratching sound came again, and then Aries' voice, louder and clearer now. "Cal told me something else, too. Apparently Cass can touch you. So do we need to mount a rescue, or is this a do not disturb situation like Cal thinks it is? Daimon wasn't going to answer that question. Apparently his silence was answer enough for Ares. I'll call off the search party then. Valen was looking ready to step to Hong Kong. You're lucky you answered this time, or you would have had unwelcome company. Ares' voice brightened, losing the hard edge, and he chuckled as Valen muttered something in the background, probably about stepping to Hong Kong to disturb them anyway. Just be back before dark, and be careful, okay? Now his brother sounded like a strict parent, and it grated a little. But he let it slide because he had felt protective of Ares too when he had lost his power and found Megan. Daimon had worried that Megan would end up hurting his brother. It was understandable that his brothers would feel the same concern about Cass. Sure, he mumbled into the phone, shutting out the sound of the water running in the adjoining bathroom. Tell Miranda that Cass is fine. But next time she wants to do something as reckless as following me to Antarctica without the appropriate protective gear, someone better stop her. Got it. Ares paused as if he wanted to say something more, and then added, Laters. Daimon ended the call and sank back against the mattress, his breath leaving him on a long sigh as he dropped the phone on the bed beside him and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't looking forward to returning to Tokyo. He could only imagine how badly his brothers were going to tease him and Cass. Daimon tossed the navy covers aside and rolled from the bed, and huffed when the shower switched off, his opportunity to join Cass there slipping through his fingers. It was probably for the best. While she could use a spell to protect her from his ice when he touched her, he wasn't sure that magic would protect her if he froze the water around her, and that was bound to happen if he showered with her. He doubted she would find the alternative arousing. Normally, when he showered, he cranked the water up to the point where it would scald a normal person, and even then, he would end up with the parts of him that weren't directly under the spray of water covered in a fine layer of frost. Cass emerged from the bathroom, tucking a black towel in around her breasts, and stopped. Her pale blue eyes lifted to meet his across the room, a small smile curling her lips, drawing him to her. He crossed the room and feathered his fingers down her jaw, eased her head back, and dropped a kiss on her lips. She made a small noise of appreciation. I could definitely get used to this. When he went to kiss her again, she pressed her palms to his bare chest, her touch light but commanding. He looked down into her eyes and sighed as he caught the question in them. Ares offered to send a rescue team. He thought maybe you were holding me against my will. He meant it to sound teasing, but her beautiful face blackened and sparks lit her eyes. All of your brothers think so ill of me. She twisted away from him and her shoulders lifted in a soft sigh. Not true. He shook his head when she cast him a glance that said it was. They're just being protective. It's what brothers do. The light faded from her eyes and she looked down at her feet. I wouldn't know. You don't have any siblings? When she hesitated to answer that question, a crinkle forming between her fine black eyebrows, he added, Do you have any family? A tiny shake of her head. She tried to smile, but it faltered, and gods, it broke his heart to see it and feel the shift in her mood. He hadn't meant to hurt her with that question, with talking about his brothers so casually. If he had known it was a sore subject for her, he would have kept his big mouth shut. Eric felt like family, she whispered, attempting another smile. Her eyes glittered with emotions as she finally looked at him, with tears that tore at him, had him closing the gap between them again and wrapping his arms around her. He had been jealous of Eric before, too wrapped up in his own feelings to notice how badly hers had been hurt by his death. Sorry, he muttered and stroked his fingers down her damp hair. He pressed a kiss to it and cursed when he left frost blooming on the wet strands. He tried to pull back, but she wrapped her arms around his waist, pinning him to her. Don't, she murmured, clutching him so tightly that the ache in his heart worsened. The spell will kick in. Don't let me go. He didn't intend to. Not now, not ever. He stroked her hair, caressed her shoulders, felt strangely vulnerable as he held her like this, as if he was the one who was hurting. Maybe it was seeing Cass, his indomitable sorceress, brought so low and desperate for someone to hold her together, for him to hold her together, that made him feel that way. He couldn't remember ever being needed like this. Daimon stood there, holding her, giving her the moment she needed and wishing there was something more he could do for her. He pressed another kiss to her hair and murmured against it. I don't know anything about your situation, but you have family, Cass. She dipped her head, released him, and brought her right hand up to her face, her actions hidden by her fall of black hair. When she straightened, her eyes were red, but she had erased all trace of her tears. Almost all of them, anyway. He lifted his hand and caught one glistening teardrop on his index finger, stared at it as it froze into a perfectly clear crystal of ice that glittered like a diamond. "The coven," she started. He shook his head. "I meant Marinda. Marinda is your family. I didn't get to choose my family, but if I had been able to choose it like you were able to choose Eric and Marinda, I probably would have chosen my brothers. Or maybe subbed a few out. They can drive me crazy at times. I'm not saying this well. I just wanted to say that you got to pick your family, and I think you chose pretty damn good. I can see Marinda means a lot to you." Cass nodded, smiled. "She's like a sister and a daughter. I've known her from before she was born, and I watched her grow up. I learned so much about what it was like to be a real family from her. Or at least I thought I did. Coming here, meeting you and your brothers, it made me realize I didn't really know what a family was." "Your coven isn't like a family." She shook her head, frowned, and then nodded. It is. It is my family, and it's dear to me. But it's just different." Warmth shone in her eyes, backing up her words, making him see that she meant them and that her coven was dear to her, important and necessary. He wanted to probe more so he could understand what was different about her coven that made her feel she had never really known what a family was like, but she drew down a breath, sighed it out, and tilted her head up. "I had an idea when I was in the shower." He smiled. "Did it involve me being in the shower too?" A pretty blush stained her cheeks, and she pushed his chest with her right hand. "No. Yes. But this idea came after that." He slipped his arm around her waist and tugged her closer to him again, glad to see the storm clouds lifting from her eyes. His gaze dropped to her lips, hunger to taste them rising inside him again. "So let's hear it." "I can't when you're looking at me like that. I just want to kiss you." She leaned towards him, pressing her chest to his. "So kiss me," he husked. She tiptoed and captured his lips, her kiss brief but passionate, rousing fire in his veins that lingered when she pulled back again, a sigh escaping her. He wanted more. Wasn't sure he would ever get enough of kissing her. "I want to help you and your brothers." She raised her hands and framed his face with them, looking deep into his eyes, hers revealing how much she wanted that. "I have some books at home. One's about forbidden magic. They might be helpful. If nothing else, they speak of necromancy. I'd like to get them and some other things." He nodded. "I'll take you." Mostly because he didn't want to let her out of his sight. He wasn't sure how much the Erinyes knew about her, and he wasn't going to risk them knowing about her island home, letting her go off alone. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if she ended up hurt or worse because he hadn't gone with her. "I was hoping you'd say that." She pressed closer, the smile that tugged at her lips sending a hot thrill through him as her gaze turned hooded. "Maybe we could hide from your brothers a little longer there." That sounded more than good. He didn't want to face his brothers, and he had the impression she didn't want to face them yet either. Both of them were going to get a grilling when they returned. He forced himself to release her and rifled through his dresser for some underwear and a fresh roll-neck long-sleeve t-shirt. As he tugged on his trunks, Cass sighed, drawing his gaze to her. She stared longingly at his backside, and then her blue eyes lifted to lock with his. "It's such a shame to cover up all that perfection." He stifled the blush that wanted to climb his cheeks by jerking his chin towards her bare curves. "I'd say the same about you, but I'm damned if I want you parading around like that in front of anyone but me." Her smile turned wicked, teasing. "Someone sounds a little possessive." "A little?" He shook his head at that. "Try a lot. I'm doing my best not to lock you in this room to keep you away from my brothers and—" He trailed off, the words he had been about to say echoing around his mind. "And any other male." Daimon, she whispered. He shook his head. Let's not. Not right now. Because he wanted to keep living in this dream, fooling himself for as long as he could. He pulled his top on and followed it with a pair of black jeans, found some socks, and then hunted for his boots, leaving Cass in the bedroom, needing a moment to breathe. Daimon stopped in front of his boots where he had discarded them near the couch, stared at them as he tried to piece himself back together, rebuilding the illusion that everything was going to go the way he wanted it to. Things never did. He tugged his socks on and jammed his feet into his boots, had just finished lacing them when Cass emerged, her sinful curves clad in black leather trousers and her corset. The look on her face said they were going to have to talk about things eventually. Eventually was a damned long way off as far as he was concerned. He was going to fight for her, and he was going to win. He crossed the room, his boots loud on the pale marble floor, and took hold of her hand, stepped with her to Caravastasis, to the small walled garden that hugged her island home. Power immediately pressed down on him from all directions, had his gaze whipping to the terrace of the white building, to the 5 women who stood there all dressed in black. Witches. Cass tensed, her fingers clenching his so tightly it hurt, and her fear washed over him. Daimon stared down the 5 witches. It seemed he was going to be fighting for Cass much sooner than he had anticipated, because he was damned if they were going to take her from him. Chapter 24. Daimon guided Cass behind him and faced the witches. One with sleek golden hair stepped down from the terrace and moved towards him, the other 4 following her. What is the meaning of this? The blonde sorceress looked from him to Cass as she emerged from behind him. I'm helping this god and his brothers with an important mission. Cass's voice hitched, wobbled a little as she tilted her chin up, and he wanted to check on her, but kept his eyes on the witches. She was afraid of these women. He could sense it in her as she braved a step forwards, drawing level with him. Cassandra, we have given you time, more than enough. We have accepted your delays, your excuses. They weren't excuses. I have important— Cass slammed her mouth shut as the blonde cast her a withering look, silver-violet flecks sparking like lightning in her dark eyes. You will come with us. You will return to your family and fulfill your duty. No more delays. Over his dead body. He had only just found Cass, and he wasn't going to lose her. He wasn't going to let these witches take her from him when she clearly didn't want to go with them. While he had been trying to fool himself into believing she didn't want to give herself to another male, to bear his child, he felt sure of it now. He focused, silently mustering his strength, calling forth his power, stoking it so it was ready for him to unleash it at a moment's notice. The lead witch's dark eyes slid to him. It dares to threaten us? Damn, she had sensed the rising power within him. Nothing else for it, then. He shrugged, and ice shot up from the earth beneath her. His grin faded before it could fully manifest as she disappeared, gone in the blink of an eye, together with the other witches. Had they teleported away? Had he won? That was easy. He almost grinned. Daimon! Cass lunged for him, panic lacing her voice. Before she could reach him, one of 2 brunette witches appeared between them and shoved her back while launching an orb of twisting blue and violet light at him. Daimon stepped and reappeared on the flat roof of the small white house, exhaled hard when the spell tore up the garden, leaving a huge crater in the dirt where he had been. Maybe this wasn't going to be so easy after all. He growled and threw his hand forwards, launching shards of ice at the witch as she made a grab for Cass. The brunette gasped and shot backwards, snatching her hands to her chest as the ice shards slammed into the earth between her and Cass, creating a wall between them. Please, I am only helping this god. It's a contract. Cass's voice cut off as she threw a panicked glance at him, her gaze colliding with his. He tensed as he sensed power behind him, stepped and snarled as fire raked down his back, flames licking around him in the darkness of the teleport. Daimon! Cass shrieked, her fearful scream following him into the black abyss. When he landed behind Cass, he grabbed her arm in one hand and swept his other one upwards. Great spears of ice shot up from beneath the witch on the roof. She nimbly dodged them, but he kept them coming. They rolled in a wave towards her wherever she ran, the ice shattering a few feet behind the tip of the wave. A tip that caught her in the calf and ripped an agonized cry from her as she went down. Daimon grinned and focused his power on the witch, on dealing a killing blow. "No!" Cass seized his arm and pulled him backwards, and he faltered, looked at her, and caught the fear in her eyes. Fear for her fellow witch now. He hesitated, and the witch was swift to make her escape, disappearing into the ether. "Shit," he muttered as he sensed the conflict in Cass, saw it shining in her eyes as she glanced between him and the remaining witches where they were regrouping, forming a wall between him and Cass's home. As much as he wanted to do it, he couldn't kill these witches. If he did, it would only upset her. He could see how torn she was as she turned to the witches, her dark eyebrows furrowing as she stepped in front of him. They were Cass's family, and he would hate it if someone killed one of his family. "Please, this is just a contract." Cass cast him a pained look when the lead witch looked as if she didn't believe that, as if she knew that Daimon was something more to her. He hated that look in her eyes, because he had the terrible feeling she was considering going with them to stop the fight. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let them take her. Darkness surged through him, had his nails transforming into short claws and his canines aching as they elongated into fangs. Ice rippled over his fingers, hardened and transformed them into long talons as the air chilled around him. He flexed them and snarled at the witches as colorful light glowed from their palms, magic that laced the air with a tremendous feeling of power. Cass didn't want them to fight, but neither he nor the witches were willing to back down. He didn't want to hurt Cass, but he was going to have to in order to keep her with him, because he couldn't let these witches take her. He wouldn't. She belonged with him. She was his. Mine. The darkness within him snarled that word. It drummed in his blood with every hard beat of his heart as he prepared himself. He would do his best not to kill any of the witches, but he was going to fight. For her. The witches hurled the spells at him as one, and he stepped, appeared behind one. He grabbed her by the back of her neck. She shuddered and cried out, the sound harrowing as it echoed across the sea before them. Ice rapidly spread over her shoulders and back, and he released her as she went down. Out of action, but not dead. He wasn't sure if these witches knew the same spells as Cass did, or how long his ice would be effective against them when he was using it to drain them of their strength and knock them out rather than kill them. All he knew was that he needed to protect Cass. That need blazed inside him, controlling his actions, commanding him to deal with the witches in the only way he could without hurting his sorceress. He stepped again and landed near the next witch, roared as pain ripped up his side, and he staggered backwards. Violet smoke poured from a wound above his hip, the same place he had taken a nasty hit from the demons last night. He bared his fangs at the blonde witch, who had her arm outstretched towards him, and cast his right hand at her before he could consider what he was doing, rage getting the better of him. 5 spears of ice formed and shot towards her. The witch didn't move. She casually raised her hand, her palm facing him, and the ice spears shattered as they struck an invisible barrier. "Deal with him!" The witch turned imperiously away from him, as if he was nothing more than a gnat, insignificant and unworthy of her time. He was a son of Hades, a god. He would teach her how to show him more respect. The darkness pouring through his veins surged stronger, claiming more of him, and he was swift to give in to it. He leaped at the lead witch on a vicious snarl. One of the other witches shot into his path, and he grabbed her by her throat, didn't even look at her as he tossed her aside. In the distance, water splashed as she hit it. He lunged for the blonde witch, growled when the woman evaded him, too fast for him to grab. The same spell Cass had used to taunt him in Hong Kong. He focused his senses, grinned as he felt her, and twisted and launched his hand out. His hand clamped down on her forehead as she appeared, icy talons curling around to pierce her flesh and draw blood that stained her blonde locks. "Belle!" Another witch shrieked, and fire slammed into his back, shoving him forwards and heating his skin to an unbearable degree for a moment before his ice kicked in again. He stared into Belle's dark eyes and grinned at her to flash fangs as he tightened his grip, but still couldn't bring himself to kill. He glanced at Cass, caught the pain and fear in her eyes as she stood as still as a statue, saw the conflict that ran through him as it ran through her too. Belle's irises brightened to silver lilac, and she grabbed his arm in both hands. He bellowed, entire body juddering as pain lit him up, fire that felt as if it was searing his insides, melting them. His icy talons shattered. "Daimon!" Cass's voice rang in his ears as he struggled against the next wave of fire, as it wrapped around him and consumed him. Her voice gained pitch. "Please don't hurt him!" She said something else, something muffled by the sound of his own agonized roar as it tore from his lips. And then the fire ceased. The witch released him. Daimon sagged to his knees, breathing hard, entire body still aflame as he called on his ice, desperate for the cold to soothe him and steal away his pain. "Stop, and I'll go with you," Cass said. For a sweet moment, he thought she was speaking to him. "Very well." Belle's voice cut through him, had him surging to his feet as he heard the victory in it. She hadn't won this battle. He mustered his ice, fought the lingering effects of her spell to reform the crystal talons over his fingers, and locked his knees, refusing to let the weakness invading him send him back onto them. He had to stop the witches. This time he wouldn't hold back. He wouldn't. Cass would hate him if he hurt her family, but he would bear it, because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her, or the thought of what would happen if she returned to her coven. Cass stepped between him and Belle. "Move aside, Cass," he said, his eyes remaining locked on the witch she was protecting. "You don't need to go with them. I can handle this." "Daimon," Cass murmured, and he glanced at her, meant only to check on her, but lingered as he saw the hurt in her eyes, the pain she tried to mask with a smile. She didn't want to go. It was right there in her eyes for him to read, all of her feelings about her coven and what was going to happen to her laid bare. "Just come to me, Cass. We can leave. Never come back." He extended his hand to her, let the ice melt from it as he turned it palm up, reaching for her, silently begging her to take it. Sorrow flitted across her face, and he wasn't sure whether it was because she was going to do as he asked and was sad that she was turning her back on her family, or because she was going to leave him. "Cass," he whispered and stretched for her, needing her to take his hand, needing her to choose him. She drew down a breath, tipped her shoulders back, and came to him. Relief swept through him as she stroked her fingers over his palm. His smile faltered, a frown flickering on his brow as his head grew foggy, thoughts spinning and colliding, and his body felt heavy. He looked at her, his eyebrows furrowing as disbelief swept through him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice so low he barely heard her eyes shimmering with hurt and regret and fear. He tried to shake his head, growled through his teeth when it felt too heavy to move, and struggled to find his voice as the fog grew thicker, clouding his mind. "Don't." He couldn't manage any more than that, could only stare into her eyes and see she had heard the rest of what he had wanted to say. "Don't do this. Don't leave him." A smile wobbled on her lips, and he silently cursed her for putting on a brave face, for hiding her true feelings from him and her coven. She didn't want this. He was right about that. He had to be. So why was she doing this to him? "Go do your duty," she murmured softly, a hint of sorrow in it. "And I'll be back as soon as I've done mine." Daimon cursed her again in his head and struggled against the effects of the spell, desperation mounting inside him, driving him to do something because doing her duty meant getting pregnant. He couldn't bear the thought of her with another man, doing something she didn't want, letting that male and her coven use her in that way. "You don't want this," he croaked, each word a labor that stole his strength. Each word seeming to cleave a wound in Cass, pulling the pain she was trying to conceal to the surface of her eyes. "I have to do it," she said, nothing more than a throaty, pained whisper. Her black eyebrows furrowed, and she reached her hands up towards his face, stopped herself, and flexed her fingers. Before he could say another word, Belle seized hold of her, and they all disappeared. Pain tore through him, chased by fury so deep that the darker side of his blood howled for violence, for revenge, hurt by the thought she would betray him like this. He wrestled against the spell she had hit him with, refusing to let it disable him any longer. She didn't want this. He couldn't let her do it. He had to stop her. She would hate herself if she let someone do this to her. A feeling hit him, rocked him so hard he was surprised he remained standing as the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis around him. He more than cared about her. He was in love with her. He stared at her small home, feeling her in it and the garden, smelling her in the warm air, replaying over and over how she had looked at him when she had been in his arms, recalling how he had felt then, happy, afraid, excited. It dawned on him that he had never really taken a risk in a relationship, even when he thought he had. He had always gone with the flow, never feeling anything he could label as true love, never willing to let anyone in too deep. But gods, he wanted that with Cass. She was under his skin already, had burrowed her way deep into his heart, had done it without him noticing. Or maybe he had been in denial because he had thought a relationship with her was impossible. Maybe he had been falling for her from the moment he had first set eyes on her. It had been more than a craving he had felt then. It had been the first stirrings of love. And now his beautiful, enthralling, brave sorceress had left him. But he wouldn't let her go that easily. He knew she needed to do her duty, that it was important to her just like her family were. But he couldn't stand the thought of her bearing another man's child. There had to be a way to keep her with him. She was his, and he needed her, more than he could ever make her see, even if he had thousands of years with her. An image popped into his head. Cass pregnant, her gaze downcast at her swollen belly as she ran her hands over it, heavy with child. His eyes stretched wide. With his child. He shook at the thought of that, wanted it, but feared it so much at the same time. It would keep her with him, but it would also place her in even more danger. The demons would target her, seeking to weaken him by taking her and their unborn child from his life. He couldn't survive that again. Not this time. Losing Cass would kill him. His love for her was soul deep, burning inside him, fierce and consuming, absolute. He loved her. The sort of love that made a god crazy. He didn't want to risk her, but he didn't want to lose her either. He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure what he wanted. Did he want a child with Cass? The image of her pregnant with his child was wondrous and addictive, warming him despite the cold that numbed him. He wanted to see her like that, but it was too dangerous. He cursed and fought to inch his foot forwards, shock rippling through him when he found he could move. His feet were heavy, muscles liquid beneath his skin, but he managed a few steps, reaching the terrace of her home. Daimon clutched the wooden pole that supported the slatted roof and pulled himself up onto the terrace. He pressed his hand to the white wall to his right and supported himself as he trudged forwards, breathing hard with each step he managed. A god on a mission. He had to find Cass. He wasn't sure what he would do when he located her, and he wasn't going to worry about it. Finding her came first. He would tackle whatever came after that when it came. Right now, he just needed to see her. He just needed to speak with her, before it was too late. Daimon made it inside and turned left, gripped her desk and pulled the drawers open. He grabbed all the papers she had stacked inside them and tossed them onto her desk. He ignored the ones that weren't from her coven and read the ones that were. And something struck him. They were all summons, and they dated back years. He pressed his hands to the top of the wooden desk and leaned forwards, over one letter in particular. The first one she had received and ignored. She had been avoiding this for so long, and it boosted the feeling he had. She didn't want this. What had made her change her mind now? Him. He squeezed his eyes shut and dug his claws into the desk. She had gone with the witches to protect him, to stop them from killing him. Daimon cursed her again, and stepped. Chapter 25. Black blood sprayed from the puncture wound in the male's neck, splattered across the front of Karis's shirt as he tightened his grip on the demon, pressing claws into his flesh as he lifted him into the air. The thing writhed, legs thrashing as he desperately grappled with Karis's arm, short claws tearing through his black shirt sleeves. Karis grinned as his grip tightened further, as the wretch's face reddened and his eyes rolled back, gasping breaths leaving his lips as his struggles slowed. Pleasure rolled through Karis, sweet and intense as he watched the thing slowly die. As he sensed the others in the shadows around him twitching in the darkness, closing in on him where he stood in the middle of the broad swath of green in the heart of Paris. When the demon had gasped his last desperate breath and stared at him with sightless eyes, Karras casually discarded him, slowly turned and scanned the darkness, his heightened vision picking out all the demons that hid in the bushes and behind the trunks of the trees that surrounded the edge of the park. Karras canted his head, waited. Anticipation hummed in the air around him, the night thick with it, buzzed inside him. He rolled his shoulders and twisted his neck, loosening and warming up his muscles, waited. A breath, a shift in the air. Karras pivoted, lips stretching in a grin as he slammed his palm into the throat of a female and grasped it, as shadows wrapped around her legs and she screamed, rending the silence with her desperate, pathetic shriek. She died too quickly. He tossed her aside and flexed his claws. Waited. Two broke cover and rushed him. Another two followed hot on their heels. Karras let them reach him, let them land a blow, because it was nice to let them feel they stood a chance against the darkness, against him. The last of the four reached him, and he began to fight back, raked claws over the thigh of one as he dropped and spun his leg out, catching the ankles of another. The two collided and grappled with each other as they went down. He spun up onto his heels and grinned as he backhanded the only female, sent her flying across the grass to slam into a tree. Wood cracked. Black blood gushed from the point where a branch impaled her. 5 more demons charged him. Karras ducked beneath the blow of a large male and twisted, slammed his fist into the demon's gut and lifted him off his feet with the force of his blow. He pulled back, and before the wretch's feet could touch the earth again, he smashed his other fist into the fiend's face in an arcing blow that drove him into the dirt on his back. He kicked his right foot forward, the heel of his black leather shoe hitting its target, the wretch's cheek. A wet crunch broke the silence, and the male went limp. Karras's green eyes flicked to his next victim, the one he had clawed, who was spilling foul-smelling blood all over the place as he tried to limp away, heading for the tree line. Karras tilted his head back, looked down his nose at the thing, grinned. Shadows shot up around the male, twisted and branched into 100 vicious barbs that pierced the male all at once. He didn't even get the chance to scream. The hideous mash of feelings inside Karras still refused to dissipate. He glared at the 5 demons and took them all down in one exhilarating blast of shadows. He needed stronger opponents, worthy opponents. He needed this tangled, twisted web of feelings out of him, needed to purge. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, too many to handle. 100 unwanted emotions followed them. Callistos, Valen, Merrick, all harmed because of his decision to seal the gates. Escher, missing because he had failed to close the gate here in this very city, a gate he was meant to be in total control of and should have been able to shut down before his brother had recklessly chased a demon into it. Eli, a bastard demon now roaming the underworld because of that failure to control the gate. Karras sucked down a breath and then another, but the weight remained pressing heavily upon his shoulders. A weight that refused to lift, a weight he knew he should bear. The welfare of his brothers rested on his shoulders. What happened to the gates was his sole responsibility. His father had made that painfully clear, together with something else. Failure was not an option, and he was failing. A grin stretched his lips as he punched a hole through the chest of a demon, as he pulled his fist free and the male fell. But he felt nothing. So he did it again, cutting down another demon, and again, devouring one with his shadows, and again, and again, and again, until 20 dead demons formed a circle around him, another dozen scattered across the grass at a distance, and it still wasn't enough. It was never enough to purge the pain, the one that festered deep inside him, eternal. More demons broke from the shadows. Karras didn't pay them any heed as he looked down at his blood-stained hands, as the plain silver band on his thumb caught the slender light and glinted at him. He rubbed his other thumb over it, clearing the blood away, feeling the warmth of the metal. Metal of the gods, forged on Olympus, where she was. Images flashed across his eyes, images that had haunted him for weeks now, a constant presence whether he was asleep or awake. They tormented him. He saw her. Sleek black hair twisted in braids knotted at the back of her head, curves clad in black and silver armor, pale green eyes soft and warm, and rose lips curling with a smile. As she looked at another male, as she took his hand and clutched it to her, as she drove a blade through Karis's heart over and over again, just as she had that day. He jerked to his left and then his right, pain stinging his body as the demons tore at him. He kept his eyes on the ring she had given him, a token of their friendship. She had called it that, and he had foolishly believed it to be so much more. He growled when something obscured his view of it, ripped them away and shoved them. As soon as he could see it again, he continued to stare at it, aware of the demons tearing at him but uncaring. If they tore him apart and he died here, would she mourn him? He stroked the ring he couldn't bring himself to discard. The warmth of it was comforting, easing some of the noise in his head, the feelings tangled inside him. A tie to Enyo that he couldn't bear to sever. Did she ever think of him? She had never shared the feelings he had for her. He was certain of that. She couldn't even bring herself to look at him, couldn't bring herself to speak with him. She always chose Merrick when she had information to relay. Never him. She would never choose him. Because she belonged to another. She belonged to that man he kept seeing her with, the one the demon Lisabetta had revealed to him in one of her illusions. Her husband. The darkest part of him snarled at that, and shadows exploded around him, instantly killing the demons nearest him. He felt nothing as he slaughtered those who remained, ripping through them with his claws and his shadows, drenching his hands in their black blood, until only silence remained. No demons on his senses, no matter how fiercely he wished there were. He spun the ring around his thumb with his index finger, staring at it as he reached into his pocket with his other hand. As he withdrew the small black stone box, he slid the lid open with his thumb and plucked a single black pill from it, snapped the box closed, and stared at the tiny oval balanced between his thumb and index finger, at the ring that encircled his thumb just below it, a ring that caused him pain, a pill that took it away. Karis closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of that ring, and placed the pill on his tongue, swallowed it, fell onto his back in the middle of the carnage he had wrought, and flicked his eyes open, stared at the stars as the chilling cold slowly crept through him, as that tangle of unwanted emotions unraveled and dissipated, leaving nothing behind, leaving him empty, just the way he liked it. Chapter 26. Cass walked in silence, numbed not only by the frigid cold of the white world around her, but by the thought of what she had done, and what she was about to do. She kept her chin up and shoulders back, refusing to let the witches who were marching her towards the grim gray building ahead of her see her fear, her guilt, her despair. Her destiny loomed in that featureless block-shaped building that had never resembled a factory as much as it did now as she approached it, a soulless place built for churning out witches, keeping her coven strong, one of the most powerful in the world. Her thoughts and her heart were back in the Aegean with Daimon. She was falling for him, and there was nothing she could do about it, and gods, it was frightening. He wouldn't understand why she was doing this, and he wouldn't forgive her for hurting him as she had. She was sorry for both of those things, but this was the only way. It hurt, though, had tears threatening to line her lashes as she marched forwards, the pain in her heart in danger of rending it in two. For a moment she had been swept up in a glorious dream, one where she was able to love someone and have a future of her own choosing. "Come now, Cassandra," Belle said beside her, that motherly tone grating and making Cass want to glare at her. "This is your home. It is time you remembered that." Cass looked at the building again. It wasn't her home. That feeling beat deep in her aching heart. Her home was back on that island with Mr. Milos. She looked at the witches around her. This wasn't her family. Her family was in Tokyo, probably worrying about her. She wished she could have spoken to Mari before coming here, could have had the chance to explain things to her and to tell her that she would be home soon, back with her, back with Daimon. The ache in her heart worsened to a deep, throbbing pain, and she lowered her eyes to the path someone had shoveled. Would he ever forgive her? Would he ever understand? Belle's hand clamped softly around her wrist, pulling her focus away from him. "Cassandra, this is your duty." She nodded. "I know. You must fulfill it as everyone does. There are no exceptions.
What we do for the greater good of the coven.
Belle's eyes remained cold as she smiled, one Cass assumed was meant to be reassuring. At close to 800 years old, Belle was one of the most powerful witches in the coven, and one who ran it with only two other witches. The blonde had been in charge of Cass since the moment she had been born, had overseen her upbringing and education. Belle was the closest thing to a mother that Cass had. But she still wanted to rebel, to flee into the endless white and hope they never caught her. It was pointless. If they didn't catch her, they would target those who were dear to her to draw her out of hiding. Mari and Daimon would be at the top of that list.
I know,
She repeated hollowly, sickness brewing inside her as she thought about what she was going to do. Warmth washed over her as two of the witches opened the doors to the coven and she stepped inside, with Belle still gripping her wrist. Wise witch. If Belle didn't keep hold of her, she was liable to run. Wasn't sure she could stop herself even when she knew it would be a terrible mistake. Cass forced herself to look at the blonde, at the other witches who escorted her into the enormous foyer of the coven as the doors closed behind them, and at the groups of young witches who were silently moving across it, dressed in the same drab-gray color as the building. She had been one of those children once, a little over 2 centuries ago, obeying the rigid rules of the coven and remaining silent, afraid of smiling in case she was reprimanded, terrified of laughing. But there had been better times, too, when she had been in the dorms with the other witches of her age, away from the scrutinizing and firm gazes of the teachers. There had been laughter then, potions gone hilariously wrong, incantations that had gone awry with amusing consequences, and a hell of a lot of bonding over a mutual dislike of the teachers and the adults. She had made friends here, one she remained in contact with despite the fact many of them were now spread across the globe. So as much as she hated it at times, this was her family. She told herself that on repeat, hammering it home. She had sworn to do this duty when she had been on the verge of embarking on her life in the wider world, reciting a promise in the ritual that took place for every witch who chose to leave the coven, and she would, for the sake of her family.
We shall give you a moment to prepare in your old quarters.
Belle finally released her. Cold swept through Cass. She swallowed hard. They expected her to go to the man right now? She had thought she would have some time to settle in at least, to gather her courage. She pressed a hand to her stomach, unable to stop herself from reacting, and Belle's dark eyes narrowed.
This isn't going to be a problem, is it?
Belle looked ready to seize hold of her hand again and drag her to the man if Cass said that it was. She forced herself to shake her head, breathed through the panic that gripped her and tried to calm her mind. She had been prepared to do this for centuries, had known this time would come. She could do it. She blew out her breath. It fogged in the air. She frowned and looked at the other witches, at the way their breath did the same, and then down at her arms as her skin turned to gooseflesh. The doors behind her burst open, and frigid wind blasted into the room, had her teeth chattering as she whirled to face that direction at the same time as Belle. She struggled to maintain her balance as ice rapidly spread across the floor and climbed the walls, chilling the soles of her feet and tearing shocked gasps from several witches. Snow swirled into the building, as thick as a blizzard, obscuring her view of the outside world. She peered into the storm as it battered her, tiny flakes stinging her eyes. A shape formed. Tall, lean, formidable. The snow fell to form a thick layer on the floor, swirled around her ankles and piled up in the corners of the room and against the furniture. The temperature dropped so rapidly that many of the younger witches collapsed and older ones rushed to help them, gathering them into their arms and transporting them away. Out of the reaches of the god who strode towards her through the storm, his handsome face set in dark lines, his eyes as white as snow ringed with darkness, and spikes of clear ice rising like a crown from his silver-white hair. Icy talons glittered over his fingers as he flexed them, and fangs flashed between his lips as he sneered at Belle. A god on a warpath. A god who had never looked so damned hot. Around Cass, the other 4 witches began muttering incantations, and colorful light flared from their palms as the spells built. Relief to see him gave way to dread. Cass cursed him for coming after her and making this all so much harder on her. Just the sight of him had her wanting to run into his arms, but she had to go through with her duty. She couldn't turn her back on her family. She couldn't. He raised his hands and ice shot up around her, numbing her skin, and the four witches spat foul words about him as it encased them, leaving just Cass and Belle for him to deal with. She glanced at the blonde witch, a plea bubbling up her throat, but Daimon held up his hands and spoke. "I'll give Cass the child you want." Cass rocked back on her heels, her gaze whipping to him as a single word burst from her lips. "No!" Shock danced across his face, followed by darkness that invaded his irises, tainting them with more black. "I'm not good enough for you." His eyes searched hers, and she cursed herself again as she caught the pain in them. "You're rejecting me?" No, she wasn't. She shook her head, hoping he would see that in her eyes, afraid of putting voice to those words as her heart ached, throbbing painfully in her breast. When he looked as if he might attack the coven to stop her or do something worse, like leaving without another word, she dragged her courage up. He deserved to know the reason she didn't want him to be the one to impregnate her and provide the coven with the child they demanded. She took a step towards him, regaining his focus, pulling his eyes away from Belle and the others and narrowing the world down to only him at the same time. "It'll kill you," she whispered, her eyes leaping between his as her eyebrows furrowed. "Surrendering a child to this place, sacrificing all ties to it." His eyes rapidly darkened and shifted to beyond her, to the place where the children had been when he had entered, and something built in them, something dark and terrible. "Is that what happened to you?" he said, his voice a low growl as his gaze edged back to her. "You said you didn't have a family. Is this what you meant? You never knew your parents. You don't know if you have siblings here." She closed her eyes, drew down a slow breath, and fixed them on him as she opened them again. "It's the way of all covens." He stared deep into her eyes, the pain that built in his a reflection of what she felt inside. She watched as it all dawned on him, as he realized that she was right and that he hated it. He couldn't let the coven take a child of his and strip everything from it, the love of its parents, its family, to mold it into a witch loyal to the coven and the coven alone. "Go," she whispered, pain expanding inside her, spreading through her until it filled all of her and she had to fight back the tears. "I can't." Two words spoken with an edge that said he meant them. "Not without you. I can't leave you here, Cass, knowing that you don't want this." She swallowed hard. He held his hand out to her, his eyes softening, the darkness in them fading to reveal ice blue. "Fuck this place. Fuck this duty." The ice talons that covered his fingers shattered and he flexed them, tempting her to take his hand. "Do you really want to bring a child into this world only to abandon it?" War erupted inside her, a battle between two sides of her heart, one that needed her family, her coven, and was afraid of losing it, and one that feared losing him and Miranda. He was asking her to choose between them. If she went with him, she would be turning her back on her coven. They had been there for her for 2 centuries, had raised her and supported her. While she didn't agree with their methods, they were her blood, her family. If she didn't go with him, she would have to do something abhorrent, something that might end up destroying her, giving herself to another man, sacrificing a child, losing Daimon. "She wouldn't be abandoning it," Belle snapped and closed her hand over Cass's left shoulder. "This coven would be its family, just as it is Cassandra's family." Cass looked at her, at the children now gathered on the landing at the top of the stairs beyond her as the snow finally settled, at the faces of her friends who had remained at the coven to work there with the children. Hurt rolled through her, because whatever path she chose, she would be losing something dear to her. If she went with Daimon, she would be ostracized, exiled from the coven. She would no longer have their protection, and they would order everyone to break all ties with her. She would no longer have her family. Her life would completely change. "This is her family," Belle said. Daimon snorted. "A family? This isn't a family. Look at it." The power in the room grew, buffeting her as the older witches with the children began to ready spells, and the four who flanked her and Belle broke free of the ice Daimon had used to cage them. Belle's grip on Cass's shoulder tightened, pinning her in place. Cass looked at Daimon, the fear rising inside her, filling her head with images of him bloodied and broken, killed in the battle that would break out if he didn't leave now.
Go!
This time, that word lacked conviction as it left Cass's lips, as she struggled with the polar desires that warred inside her, no longer sure whether she really wanted him to leave her here, fearing he might. He folded his arms across his chest. I can't. Not without you. If you can honestly, hand on heart, swear to the gods, say that you want this, that you're fine with it, then I'll go. She felt the weight of everyone's gazes on her. Daimon stared at her. She looked into his eyes, knowing what he could see as his softened further, warming this time, and a hint of concern surfaced in them. He could see her wavering. He could see that the confidence and courage she had always worn was missing now, stripped from her. She swallowed hard again and opened her mouth, only to snap it shut. Daimon didn't take his eyes off her, didn't say a word as she fought with herself, shutting out Belle as she tried to convince her to do her duty, and the other witches as they all demanded permission to attack him.
I can't,
she whispered and shook her head.
I can't.
Her shoulders suddenly dropped, all the tension rushing from her.
You're right.
She smiled slightly, gave a mirthless chuckle that seemed so out of place in the thick silence, but she felt as if she had lost her mind, because she was on the verge of doing something crazy.
I don't want this. I don't want to abandon a child. I don't want to inflict the upbringing I had on another. I don't want any of this.
She looked deep into his eyes, the numbing coldness she had felt upon letting Belle take her away from him giving way to warmth as it filled her, as hope buoyed her and chased the darkness from her heart.
I want you.
He held his hand out to her. You got me.
Cassandra!
Belle barked, and when Cass shirked free of her grip, the witch snarled,
Stop him!
Daimon stepped, appearing barely an inch from Cass, and banded his arm around her waist, kissed her as darkness embraced them, stole her away from her old life, to a new one where she could have the future she wanted with all her heart, a future with Daimon. Chapter 27. The heat of Hong Kong embraced her as Cass's feet touched solid ground again, and she kept hold of Daimon, kept kissing him as she tried to quieten the voices at the back of her mind, the ones that ran over what she had just done. She didn't want to listen to them. Her heart already felt heavy, the thought of never seeing her coven and her friends again a weight that pressed upon it. Would any of her friends visit her, risking punishment from the coven if they were discovered? The coven was strict about such things, liable to exile whoever was caught visiting her. Hey, Daimon murmured as he pulled back and brushed his palm across her cheek. His eyes were soft as she looked up into them, filled with understanding that made her feel as if there was an invisible ribbon that linked them, allowing him to see into her mind and her heart. She stared into them, her somber thoughts weighing too heavily upon her for her to conceal how she was feeling. She had just turned her back on the only family she had ever known, and the only place where she had ever belonged, and she needed to believe it had been worth it. She needed to know she had made the right decision, and that what she had with Daimon was going to last, that she wasn't going to find herself alone in a few years or even months because he had grown bored with her, or had failed to fall in love with her, like she was in love with him. His white eyebrows knitted hard above eyes that revealed so many feelings to her as they softened further, as they warmed and held hers. She felt loved when he looked at her like that, as if she was his entire world, and the sight of her in pain was killing him, filling him with a need to do something about it even when he no doubt knew he couldn't. He brought his other hand up and framed her face, his gaze earnest as he looked down into her eyes. His palms were cool against her cheeks, but she felt warm from head to toe. I couldn't lose you, he husked, his voice a sultry whisper that teased her ears, his words and the feeling she could read in his eyes lifting some of the weight from her heart. I didn't think about the consequences. I only thought about how much I needed you. And now, he trailed off into a sigh, brushed his left thumb across her cheek. smeared cool dampness into her skin. She blinked away her tears, ashamed of them and not wanting to hurt him. She had done enough of that for a lifetime. "Tell me what's wrong. Talk to me." His eyebrows furrowed as his eyes darted between hers, the look that filled them drawing the words up from her heart, because he honestly looked as if he wanted to know. "Whatever is on your mind, you can talk to me." She couldn't remember anyone other than Eric bothering to take the time to just listen to her woes and her worries. It felt so nice to have someone who would do that for her, someone who looked as if he would move heaven and earth to make her feel better.
They're my family. Were my family. This is going to take a little getting used to, and
She glanced at his chest as her courage faltered, and then blew out her breath and lifted her gaze to lock with his again, because she needed it out there. If she held it inside, it would fester and rot, eating away at her.
I'm afraid. I'll find I made a mistake in turning my back on them.
His face darkened slightly, a brief hardening of his features that lifted a moment later as his eyes softened again, like a storm cloud passing over the sun. He sighed. "You think I'm going to leave you?" Before she could say a word to defend herself, he shook his head and sighed again, drew his hands toward him and lured her closer with them. He stared down into her eyes, his swirling with white flakes that looked like the blizzard he had caused at the Coven, tempestuous and wild. "I'm not going to leave you, Cass. What I'm feeling," he swallowed hard, hesitated. "What I'm feeling isn't going to change. Never. This feeling, this is forever." Another's words echoed in her mind as she stared up into Daimon's eyes. Eric, asking her if she had ever been in love. She had told him never. Eric had said that never was a long time, and one day she would fall in love and realize what he had, that true love was forever. Cass had countered that forever was a long time, too, a long time to be stuck with the same person. But as she looked at Daimon, as she realized that she was already in love with him, she finally understood Eric.
"Forever with you doesn't seem long enough,"
she whispered, feeling on edge as those words slipped from her lips, anxious as she waited for him to say something, fearing he would ridicule her. Daimon tilted her head back, brushed his thumbs over her cheeks, and smiled down into her eyes, one filled with love. "Doesn't seem long enough for me either. So we'll make it forever and a day." He dipped his head and kissed her, a tender exploration of her lips that had warmth rushing through her, had her insides lightening as she leaned into him and wrapped her arms around his neck. He bent at the knee, banded his arms around her backside, and lifted her. Her legs fell open, his hips nestling between them as he walked with her, carrying her inside his home. She kept kissing him, her lips dancing over his, feelings bubbling to the surface, one she no longer wanted to fight, one she no longer feared. Cass sighed as he laid her down on the bed and covered her, stroked her fingers through his hair and clung to him, a different sort of fear washing through her. She had been so afraid she would never see him again. The way he held her to him, the desperate edge the kiss gained, said she wasn't alone in that feeling either. She kissed him deeper, her tongue tangling with his, losing herself in it and the feel of him holding her, in the emotions that rippled through her, one she had thought she would never experience. Gods, she loved this man. He broke away from her lips and kissed down her neck, nipped at it and sent a shiver tripping along her nerves. She leaned her head back into the mattress and relaxed into it, sighed as he stripped her corset away and worshipped her breasts. Cass lifted her arms above her head and closed her eyes, a smile working its way onto her lips as Daimon drifted lower, as he eased her leather trousers off. She shivered as he pressed kisses to her bare thighs, as his skin brushed hers, and she realized he was naked. An electric thrill chased through her as he covered her again, skin to skin, and kissed her. She wrapped her arms around his neck and sighed into his mouth as he eased into her, as he withdrew and filled her again, his pace unhurried, stirring a deep sense of connection inside her. She had never felt anything like it, was sure she never would experience anything like it with anyone other than Daimon. He kept saying that she had him, But God's, he had her too. All of her. Right down to her soul. She stroked his shoulders as she kissed him, as his breaths mingled with hers and he thrust into her, feeling as if every part of them was connected, becoming one. Release built achingly slowly, and she savored it, lost in the moment with him, feeling as if they were the only two people in the world. When it swept over her, the depth of it rocked her, had her floating in his arms and never wanting to come down. She moaned into his mouth, each meeting of their bodies sending a fresh wave of pleasure through her, warmth that rolled over her again and again. She swallowed his groan as he joined her, as he pulsed and throbbed in time with her. His breath skated across her lips as he stilled inside her. He brushed his fingers through her hair, gazed down into her eyes with so much love in his that she melted a little. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stare into his eyes, drowning in the love they held, warmed right down to her soul. He skimmed the backs of his fingers across her cheek. "I love you, Cass." Words she had never thought she would hear, and words she had never realized how badly she needed to hear from him.
"I love you too."
She choked a little on those 4 words, ones she had never thought she would say to anyone, ones that felt so right. She never wanted to be without Daimon, and the love she had for him would last forever, and a day. His phone vibrated and she cursed it as he pulled out of her, as the peacefulness of the moment ebbed. He gave her a fine view of his backside as he went for his phone, though. Delicious. She smiled wickedly as she imagined smacking it. He straightened and the screen lit up, illuminating his face. He went deathly still.
"What is it?"
She bolted upright, fearing her coven had somehow managed to find him and were already seeking retribution. Daimon swallowed hard. "Escher is back." Chapter 28. Daimon stepped the moment Cass was dressed and in his arms, his mind whirling as Aries' message ran around it. It had only been 4 words. Escher back. Code red. Code red meant everyone had cleared out of the Tokyo mansion because Escher was liable to kill anyone who set foot in it. Daimon landed in the front garden of the single-story building and looked at Cass, painfully aware of the danger he was placing her in by bringing her with him. He hadn't been able to stop himself. He couldn't leave her in Hong Kong, where she was vulnerable to not only the Erinyes who wanted to get their hands on her, but her coven too. He was under no illusion that the witches weren't going to try to take her back from him. Their fight wasn't over. He drew down a deep breath and looked at the closed wooden door of the mansion. This fight was just beginning. He could feel Escher inside, sense the rage that beat within his brother, darkness that pulsed like a wave over him. Daimon took hold of Cass's hand and led her towards the door, nerves rushing through him as he closed the distance between him and it. He wasn't sure what to expect. Chances were, Aries had ordered everyone to leave the moment Escher had returned, and that was the reason the message had been so short. Aries didn't know what state Escher was in. The scent of foul demon blood hit Daimon. His eyes widened as he realized he couldn't only sense his brother. He could sense the wraith, too. "I need a barrier, some sort of containment spell." He looked at Cass. She nodded.
"Coming right up."
It was handy having a witch for a partner. "I don't know what we're walking into, but if there's any distance between my brother and the demon, use the spell on it."
"And if there isn't?"
Light glowed from the palm of her free hand, casting a green hue across it. He wanted to say to do it anyway, to encase both the wraith and his brother within the barrier, fear that Escher might attack Cass, getting the better of him. "Give me a moment to get Escher away from him. If I can't..." He didn't want to finish that sentence. She nodded.
"I got it."
He stopped, turned, and gripped her shoulders, holding them tightly as he stared into her eyes. "As soon as the wraith is caged, you go to my room and you don't come out until I come for you. No matter what you hear."
"But..."
He pressed his finger to her lips to silence her. "I know you can handle yourself. But Escher, I can't bear the thought he might hurt you." The soft light that entered her aquamarine eyes told him that she understood. He didn't want Escher to attack her. He didn't want to have to fight his own brother. Not when Escher wouldn't be aware he was doing something wrong and would be acting on instinct. wanting to protect Daimon from someone he viewed as a threat. Daimon stepped up onto the wooden porch and removed his boots, and waited for Cass to remove hers before he opened the door. His heart pounded in his throat as the main room came into view. Escher stood in the middle of it, clutching the right ankle of the unconscious black-haired male sprawled on the tatami mats behind him. Relief hit Daimon hard, but it was short-lived as he took in the state of his older brother. Dried blood and dirt caked every inch of him, streaked across his bare chest and arms, and matted his black hair and thick, scraggly beard. Cass tensed, the barest twitch of her hand in his as rain lashed down outside and thunder pealed overhead, the typhoon hitting out of nowhere. He glanced through the open panels that revealed the garden. Not a drop of rain touched it or the house. It gave Daimon hope. Hope that Escher was aware on some level that Aiko was liable to be here in the mansion, and he didn't want to hurt her. Hope that he could get through to his brother. Daimon's gaze briefly darted to Cass. She shook her head, silently telling him that she couldn't cast the barrier while Escher was holding the wraith. He nodded and released her hand, held his palm up to her to silently tell her to give him a moment and to stay where she was. He stepped into the room, drawing slow, deep breaths to keep his nerves in check, closely watching Escher. He doubted his brother would broadcast his intent to attack, but it didn't hurt to watch for the slightest twitch. There was a chance he could reach Cass and step with her before his brother managed to strike him down. Escher continued to stare straight ahead, his face placid as he breathed hard, bare chest straining with each one. Daimon checked his wrists. Both of the braided black bands that limited his power were still in place. That was good. He lifted his gaze, fixing it on the trident inked on the inside of his brother's wrist, his favor mark from Poseidon. It was as black as night. Not so good. Daimon's eyes leaped to the arrowhead pendant that hung from the black thong around Escher's neck. The stone was tranquil blue. Daimon breathed a little easier with the knowledge that the moon was on his side at least and not affecting his brother. When the moon was full, Escher's pendant turned black, a sign that it was messing with his power and his mood, pulling on him as strongly as it did on the tides. When that happened, Escher had to be locked in the cage. Daimon hated placing him in it, but it was the only way to suppress his powers and keep the mortal world safe from harm. He rounded Escher, keeping his distance. When he could see Escher's face more clearly, relief bloomed even more sweetly inside him. His brother's eyes were blue, not red. His other side wasn't fully in control, but shit was still liable to go south at a moment's notice. It had been a long time since he had seen his brother this bad. He glanced at the unconscious demon. He needed to get his brother to release the male so Cass could cage him, but he wasn't sure how to make that happen. The wraith was Escher's trophy, the reward of a hunt that must have been intense, judging by the state of his brother. If he tried to take that prize away from Escher, his brother would attack him. He needed to convince Escher to release him. Easier said than done. Escher's blue gaze didn't shift from the wall at the other end of the room. Blood dripped down into his left eye, turning the white red and his iris a strange shade of purple. He didn't blink it away. He just kept staring, locked in a battle with himself. Daimon had seen it enough times to recognize it. His brother was still under the influence of his other side, was waging war with it. There was a sharpness in his eyes, cold calculation and darkness, exactly how he looked when his other side was in control. Daimon motioned at Cass to stay where she was and to keep quiet, and then risked it. He stepped into the path of his brother's gaze, his nerve barely holding as he did his best to look unthreatening. Escher still didn't look at him. "You've been gone a while. I was worried about you." Daimon knew better than to mention we and everyone when Escher was so far gone. He needed to just talk about him and Escher, in the singular, man to man. Bringing up his family was liable to send his brother into a tailspin that would end with him attacking anyone he viewed as a threat to it. Daimon was deeply aware of Cass as he braved a step closer to Escher. Escher's gaze tracked him this time. His brother eyed him closely, that calculating edge to his gaze sharpening further. Daimon felt as if he was looking at another person, a cold predator weighing up its potential prey. Was his brother really in there? He kept his steps slow as he rounded his brother, hoping to draw his focus away from Cass's direction, aware that if he moved too fast, he could provoke a reaction from Escher. Priority 1 was convincing Escher to release his prize and to secure the wraith before he woke up. His gaze flickered to the demon, a glance he had hoped would be quick enough that Escher wouldn't notice. Escher growled and bared fangs at him. His grip tightened on the wraith's ankle. The demon moaned. The male was alive, which was good. He could use that. Escher had clearly managed to retain enough control to convince himself to spare the wraith so they could use him for information on their enemy. "You've done well. I have the demon. I'm safe now." Daimon hid his grimace as he subtly braced himself, hoping Escher hadn't caught the fact he had almost said "we're." "I was worried about you. You have to rest now. Take care of yourself. Let me take care of you. Remember how I used to?" He searched Escher's eyes, hoping to see that he did. Emptiness stared back at him. "You're my big brother, and I was always the one who took care of you when you got into trouble." Daimon slowly reached a hand out to Escher as his cold eyes began to brighten, losing their intensity. "Come on. Let me take care of you now, Escher." His brother's expression darkened at the sound of his name, a frown knitting his black eyebrows together and causing the onyx crust that ran down one side of his face, from his hairline to the scruffy beard that coated his jaw, to crack further. "You remember me. You know you do." Daimon kept pressing, feeling he was getting somewhere. "That's why you came to me. We've always been close, always had each other's backs. That's why you came. You're safe here. I'll take care of you." He reached a hand towards the one Escher gripped the demon's ankle in. Big mistake. Escher snarled and twisted, dropping the wraith's ankle to step between Daimon and his prey. Daimon backed off as his brother advanced, flexing black claws as scarlet ringed his irises. Cass was swift to act on the opening she had been given. Green light burst from her palms and wrapped around the wraith, forming a circle of shimmering light around him. Escher turned on her with a roar. "Go!" Daimon grabbed Escher's arm and pulled him back, cursing himself as ice spread across his brother's skin. He grunted as Escher elbowed him in the face. Cass disappeared in a flash of crimson light. He grappled with Escher, struggling to keep hold of him as he snarled and elbowed him again. Stars winked across Daimon's vision as he took a hit to the nose, as blood streamed over his lips and heat spread across his face. Outside, the rain pelted the garden, filling the air with the smell of earth, and lightning struck nearby. Escher twisted free of his grip, and dread washed through Daimon as he lunged for him, fear that his brother would leave and destroy anything that stood in his path. Wind howled through the house as he managed to grab hold of Escher again, and his brother turned and slammed his palm against Daimon's throat, grabbed him, and hauled him into the air. Daimon locked his hand around Escher's wrist and hesitated. His brief reluctance to use his ice against his brother cost him. Escher slammed him into the nearest wooden pillar, and the air burst from Daimon's lungs as fire rolled across his back. His vision tunneled as he fought to breathe, struggling to get air into his burning lungs, and fear swamped him as his heart began to slow. "No." Escher sneered at him, red invading the blue of his stormy eyes. Daimon's thoughts blurred as he tried to prise Escher's hand from his throat, his actions sluggish and body slow to respond as his blood crawled through his veins and his heart stuttered. Escher was using his power over water to control Daimon's blood. His brother was going to kill him. Cass would be next. That thought had icy talons forming over his fingers, and he growled, the sound half pain and half rage, as he clawed at Escher's arms, spilling blood that instantly froze in jagged red icicles. Escher released him, and he crashed to his knees, gasped in a breath. He stumbled onto his feet and staggered left, determined to reach Cass before Escher could and get her and himself away from his brother. He glanced back at him. Escher roared and lunged for him. Their mother appeared between them in a swirl of black smoke that spiraled downwards to blend into the layers of her dress. She seized hold of Escher, gripping his shoulders in both hands. Escher growled and lashed out at her, a vicious and savage beast as he clawed at her, drawing blood as vibrantly scarlet as her hair. His nostrils flared as he drew in a deep breath. He suddenly stilled, stared at her. through crimson eyes. Daimon sank to his knees, unable to believe what he was seeing. He had never seen Escher's other side calmed by anything. He had never seen it so docile. Persephone was soft and gentle as she lifted her hands to Escher's face and framed it with her palms.
Let go. You have the wraith now, my love. You can rest.
Escher drew down a breath, was still for a tense moment where Daimon didn't dare move, and then he nodded and passed out. Persephone caught him as he fell, bringing him down gently to rest with his head on her knees. Outside, the weather instantly calmed.
I do not have much time,
their mother said, her voice as soft and light as a summer's breeze, as her green eyes came to rest on Daimon, the flecks of gold in them sparkling.
The underworld has been in an uproar. We have been trying to catch up with Escher from the moment he entered it, but whoever we sent to stop him ended up dead. In the end, our only hope was that he would find the one he was hunting, so I might have an opportunity to reach him.
She gently stroked Escher's matted black hair and looked down at him, her gaze overflowing with the love she held for him and with relief.
I wish I could stay longer,
she whispered. Daimon glanced at the garden. The seasons were at war with his mother present, flowers attempting to grow as if it was spring, and birds singing mating calls even as the autumnal colors remained. She looked at him.
Take care of him. He has been through so much.
Daimon nodded. Persephone lingered. He dropped his gaze, aware of the reason she was hesitating to return to the underworld. Long gashes cut across her shoulders and her chest, seeping blood. His father was going to be furious with Escher when she returned and he saw the state of her, and she didn't want to get Escher into more trouble. She stroked Escher's cheek, bent over and pressed a kiss to his dirty forehead.
Rest. Get better.
And then she was gone. The ground shook violently, the tremor rocking Escher where he lay on his back on the golden straw mats. When the quake stopped, Daimon pulled his phone from his pocket and fired off a message. In less than a heartbeat, his brothers surrounded him, together with Katerina, Megan, Ava, and Mirinda. And Aiko. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she sobbed as she darted forwards. Karis grabbed her arm and held her back. She looked back at his brother and then at Daimon. Daimon nodded. Mother was here. He won't wake for a while. It's safe. Karis released her. Aiko sank to her knees beside Escher, caressed his cheek, and murmured things to him in Japanese. She lifted her head, her dark eyes bleak and tears glistening on her cheeks.
We should clean him.
Daimon wanted to do that too, but he shook his head. Escher needs to rest right now. He didn't want to risk disturbing his sleep. I'll take him to his room. Karis moved around Escher, stooped and carefully lifted him, and when he looked at Daimon, Daimon nodded at him, silently thanking his brother for doing it for him. Aiko followed Karis, and Daimon trailed after them, leaving his brothers to guard the wraith. When he reached the door of his room, he slid the panel open. Cass immediately turned to face him, relief filling her blue eyes, chased by anger as they narrowed on his nose.
Oh, that beast!
She hurried to him, and he didn't chastise her about the term she insisted on using for Escher as she fussed over him, was too relieved to see she was safe too. His nose ached as she brushed her fingers down it, and then the pain was gone, the stuffiness clearing and allowing him to breathe through it again. I could get used to having you around, he murmured, and stroked his knuckles lightly across her cheek. Thanks for that, and for leaving when I asked.
If I had known he was going to make mincemeat of your nose, I would have stayed.
She petted it with a slight pout to her lips.
Your beautiful nose.
It'll be fine. Not the first time it's been broken, and it won't be the last. He dragged his gaze away from her as Karis emerged from Escher's room to his left. He nodded, looked back at Cass, and caught the question in her eyes. Mother made Escher sleep. He needs rest now. I'm not sure how long the gift Mother used will last.
I can do a spell that will keep him asleep for a few days.
Gods, could his sorceress get any more wonderful? He dropped a kiss on her lips. Thank you. She wrinkled her nose when he pulled back.
You taste like blood.
He followed her as she swept from the room, her head held high and shoulders back, not missing the nerve she was doing her best to mask as she strode with purpose towards Escher's room. A flicker of relief danced across her delicate features as she reached the doorway and saw it was only Karis and Aiko in the room with Escher. Although he also didn't miss how she kept firmly to the right, as far from Karis as she could get. He gave his oldest brother a questioning look as he entered the room and came to stand next to Aiko, but Karis refused to look at him, kept his green eyes locked on Escher where he lay on the bedding in the middle of the room. Cass kneeled by his head, and swirls of blue, purple, and black emanated from her palms, drifted over Escher's head, and disappeared into his mouth and nose as he inhaled. She lifted her gaze to Daimon, and then settled it on Aiko.
He should sleep for at least 72 hours. I can renew the spell then if necessary. Thank you,
Aiko said. When she went to kneel beside his brother, Daimon stopped her, stepping into her path. How much do you know about my brother? He searched her eyes. They were open, clear, not a hint of malice or fear in them as she said,
I know about his past. Escher told me everything.
Good. That was good. But he needed to be sure she knew what she was in for, because when Escher came around, he was going to be delicate. The slightest thing was liable to set him off again. When Escher flips, he's a different person. He might not remember what he's done when he comes around. Daimon held her gaze, needing to know she was listening to him. He might not want to remember. Escher was never big on killing. Not really. His other side, it doesn't care. It's happiest when it's killing. Escher won't be strong enough to handle remembering that. Mother said he killed everyone they sent after him. If he remembers that, she nodded.
I won't probe, I promise.
She tried to pass him, but he didn't let her. He looked back at his brother, darkness coursing through him, howling at him to keep everyone away from him and keep him safe. He needed to protect Escher. A hand came to rest on his shoulder, drawing his focus to Cass where she now stood beside him. Her blue eyes were soft as she murmured,
Let Aiko look after him too.
It was hard, but somehow Daimon managed to nod and step aside. Karis remained silent, a skeptical edge to his eyes that Aiko noticed. It was enough to halt her in her tracks.
I won't disturb his sleep,
she said, a pleading edge to her expression as she faced his brother.
I promise.
Karis stared at her for a tense minute, finally nodded. Aiko was quick to move to Escher, to kneel beside him and brush her fingers across his brow. Daimon looked at Karis. We have a wraith to question.